Chapter 532. Oh, then you can scram. The words were not polite, but the tone was very calm. Just like the judgment of the gods, it was played down, but it had the power of a conclusion that could not be changed. Tiyu's face instantly darkened, his fists clenched and unclenched, then clenched and unclenched again. His nostrils slowly and heavily exhaled. He frowned and looked at Yuan Fong. What happened? The difference in tone made Tiyu realize that he seemed to have made a mistake, but the person involved could not see clearly, so he did not react immediately. Yuan Fong opened his mouth and looked at Ti Wu. He wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, he said hesitantly, "He's trying to get information from you. Well, you were just careless for a moment. Don't go crazy after listening to him." "Trick me." Tiyu heard this and frowned even more. He ignored Yuan Fong's warning and continued to stare at the other, waiting for him to continue. "And it's like this. Your plan to sow discord just now was very good, and from the chaos on the mountain peak, it should have been effective. But you should not have made such a promise." Shaking his head, Yuan Fong's expression was a little regretful. He spread out his hands and said, "Just as I said, the other party has already realized that the situation on our side is not right, and it is very likely that they are running away. And the oath you just blurted out, sigh, it was too rushed and too heavy. This is undoubtedly telling the other party that our situation is worse than imagined, and that we cannot even waste any time on them. In this way, not only will your plan to sow discord be seen through, but it will also let the other party know that this is our last struggle. This is just a small language trap, it is not good enough to be shown. Brand people have always been crafty, Tiyu, you don't have to pay too much attention to it." His voice gradually lowered. Yuan Fong looked at Tiyu's increasingly ugly face and tried to comfort him, but in the end, he remained silent. Similar explanations were also carried out on the mountain peak. Of course, their words were not as polite to Tiyu. "Haha, that's the situation. Right now, the other party might not have the time to play with us. Of course, that person is a lunatic. It's very possible that he would attack us out of anger. However, as long as we can hold on, they will pay 10 times, 100 times, or even more. Haha, let's see if they dare to take the gamble." Looking at the stunned crowd, Tangan touched his nose and then chuckled. "Let's talk about this later. You guys are the professionals when it comes to war. But, haha, Big Brother Eltek is right. This youngster is indeed useless. As the saying goes, a young man with no hair on his mouth, and can't do things properly. Haha." As the laughter rang out, the stiff atmosphere on the mountain peak was instantly swept away. When the crowd understood Tangan's words and knew that the other party was in a passive position, cheers immediately shook the sky, and the morale was greatly boosted. Among them, Eltek and Taka lowered their heads in embarrassment and kept rubbing their hands together. The two burly men looked as if they had been possessed by a young girl whose thoughts had been exposed. They were so embarrassed that they could not show their faces. "Brother Tang En, we. They were ashamed. One must know that Tang En only asked them how they could guarantee their promise, but they immediately doubted him. No matter how one looked at it, they did not trust their brother. When they thought about how their lives were saved by Tang En, they wanted to slap themselves in the face. However, Tang En shook his head and patted their shoulders. There was no trace of resentment on his face. He said with a smile, "Haha, let's not talk about it anymore. I understand. And it's my fault for asking too hastily. I didn't inform the two of you beforehand." This was not a lie. Tang En really did understand Eltek and Taka. Because of his previous performance, his position in the team was not low. It was even higher than Frey's. In that situation, if he really handed Eltek over, no one would be able to stop him. Putting aside the combat power of the gray space, Frey also had a close relationship with him. The Spear Destroyer formation would definitely not interfere. This way, just Eltek and Taka, as well as the dozens of brand soldiers, could not do anything. No, no. Okay, let's not talk about it anymore. But I, Eltek, Taka, will say this today. In the future, as long as Brother Tang En needs any help, no matter if it is a mountain of swords, a sea of fire, the abyss, or hell, we are not strong enough, but we are qualified to be cannon fodder. Sigh, you two brothers! Looking at Eltek and Taka's determined expression, Tang En touched his forehead. He knew that it was useless to say anything else. He could only spread his hands helplessly. At this moment, who are you? An angry roar came from the bottom of the mountain again. Everyone who was celebrating was stunned. Then, they realized that it was Tiu who asked again. Then, everyone's eyes gathered on Tang En. Without a doubt, Tiu's question must be to Tang En who tricked him just now. He wanted to keep him as a memento. Rubbing his nose, Tang En lowered his head and met Tiu's gaze. He smiled. Hee, since General Tiu gave me face and asked, and a nameless soldier like me will not dare to neglect. Pause for a while, he waved his hand generously. Jack, my name is Jack. General Tiu, if you need any help in the future, feel free to come find me. F***CK. F***CK. The mountain peak was silent. Everyone was instantly petrified. They stared dumbfoundedly at this guy who did not know the limits of shamelessness. They were completely speechless. Such a scene was similar to a duel between generals before two armies went to war, solemnly announcing their names to each other. Although there was a risk of being remembered, from a certain point of view, this was also a kind of glory that couldn't be pulled off. But Tang En was different. He first waved his hand generously and then gave a fake name, Jack. Tiu murmured in a low voice. Of course, he did not know what was going on. He just remembered the name in his heart and prepared to go back and ask the intelligence agency here to investigate. The situation now was really delicate. Yuan Fong was very worried that Tiu would order the soldiers to attack in a rage. So, he carefully observed Tiu's uncertain expression and asked tentatively. Phew! Taking a deep breath, Tiu narrowed his eyes. He paused for 3 seconds, lowered his head and waved, "Let's go." After saying that, he directly rode the wolf forward. This straightforwardness made Yuan Fong, who was worried about personal gains and losses, stunned for a moment. When the officer behind reminded him, his face became happy and he quickly chased after them. In fact, Tiu's reason for doing this was very simple. Before instigating, he had already made up his mind. He knew that now was not the time to go crazy. And since this was the case with his identity, it was similar to the green mountains do not change, and the green water flows forever. Just you wait. This kind of street thug's ruthless words was naturally not something that could be said out loud. So, it was better to leave early. Out of sight, out of mind. During the conversation on the mountain peak, the surrounding barbarian soldiers did not stop moving forward. So, after Tiu and the others left, tens of thousands of barbarians entered the forest and disappeared after a few turns. Not only did Yuan Fong not react to Tiu's straightforward departure, everyone on the mountain peak was also stunned as they watched the barbarians gradually disappear in front of them. They did not recover for a long time. With a grin, Tang En gave a thumbs up in the direction where the barbarians disappeared and praised from the bottom of his heart, "Damn, as expected of a lunatic." Even though they knew that the barbarians were in a terrible situation from their previous probing and observation, Tang En and the others did not know the details. They thought that no matter what, the barbarians would at least launch a few attacks. Or they might even leave some people behind to fight to the death with them. They had also made preparations to resist. If they fought, they would not do anything else but to delay the barbarians in front of them for as long as possible. Then, they would let the barbarians suffer a backlash and pay the price. But now, the other party didn't even say a single harsh word and just walked away. This kind of unexpected behavior could only be explained by Tang En saying, "as expected of a lunatic." Normal people would never be able to understand the world of a lunatic, and they could not afford to hurt him, seeing that they had once again narrowly escaped death. Everyone was excited. But now they did not dare to show off. They asked David and the others to follow and take a look, while they quietly walked along the gentle slope and went straight into the wilderness defense zone of the Zechen Legion. It was only when David and the others caught up and confirmed that the barbarians did not have any backup plans and went straight to the other side of the mountain that cheers suddenly erupted in the boundless wilderness. "Ha, we won again! Oh, then you can get lost." Ha. Mr. Tang's words were decisive and domineering. The barbarians really listened and obediently got lost. "That's right. Ask that northern wilderness empress to personally bring her troops over to take a look." As long as Mr. Tang is here, would she dare to say no? Damn it, stop talking. What does this have to do with me? My face is already swollen. Listening to this more and more out-of-tune worship, a certain someone touched his forehead and covered his face as he scurried away. Chapter 533. The Bran and the northern wilderness had been fighting for so many years, and the front lines that stretched for thousands of miles were filled with the flames of war. If one were to exaggerate, almost every inch of the land here was soaked in dark red blood. Of course, it was only almost. Compared to the frequent battles that happened every 2 to 3 days, the Zechen Legion's defense zone was particularly peaceful. Due to the fear of Z's tyrannical power, the barbarians rarely set the flames of war on this area in the past 10 years. Even if they did, they would be successfully intercepted and dealt with on the outskirts. Therefore, the civilians in this defense zone felt very strange. They were in an area where the flames of war were burning, but they had enjoyed a peaceful life for more than 10 years. They had almost forgotten what the barbarians were like. The barbarians were like this, and so were the soldiers of the other legions. Therefore, when they arrived here, and Tucker's rich experience could not be used. It was not that they had not been to the Zechen Legion's defense zone before, but it was basically for the sake of wartime. They hurriedly walked around and left again, so they were not familiar with the terrain. Under such circumstances, the group had no choice but to simply walk towards the east, thinking that they would eventually meet the patrolling soldiers of the Zechen Legion. However, what they didn't know was that Ti Wu had already brought his men to do the demolition and removal work. They had already removed more than half of the Purple Star Army's stronghold. Therefore, if they did not walk for half a day, they could not expect to meet any living people. Fortunately, Tang En and the others were in a good mood and did not care about this. For them, after more than 10 days of running for their lives, being able to walk under the sun was already a rare blessing. In addition, they had just narrowly escaped death, and the group was joking and telling dirty jokes. It was very lively. As they talked and laughed, the group did not know how long they had been walking. It was about half a day, because the sky was gradually darkening and dusk was approaching. It was also at this time that the group finally met a group of soldiers wearing standard armor. Or more accurately, they were surrounded by the other party. The group did not panic. For people like them who entered without asking, it was inevitable that the other party would be cautious. As expected, when they got closer, they probably saw that they were not burly barbarians. The surrounding soldiers immediately stopped and put down their weapons. Then, a few burly figures came forward. He gave a standard military salute. Zechen 3rd Army Light Armored Battalion, Barthas. Returning the military salute, Thunder 4th Army Heavy Sword Battalion, Eltek. Tomahawk Battalion, Taka. New Greycoat Army, Spearbreaker, Fry. The three armies at the front lines were competing with each other both openly and secretly. However, this was a time of war, and they were united against the enemy, so there was less scheming than usual. After the introduction, the burly man named Barthas did not have the arrogance of a member of the Zechen Legion. He was rather forthright and talkative. On the other hand, Fry and the others were here to seek shelter from danger. Naturally, they chimed in. Therefore, everyone quickly contacted each other and headed to the nearest checkpoint together. Although they were temporarily sure that Tang En and the others were brand soldiers, Barthas naturally wanted to ask them why they were here. Tang En had already discussed this with Fry and the others. First, they could not say that Winard had framed them. After all, Winard was a lieutenant general. Although this was the Zechen Legion, and logically speaking, there should not be any connection between them and Winard. However, in order to avoid possible complications, the best choice was to keep it a secret before solving the problem. Next, they could talk about breaking out of the encirclement of tens of thousands of barbarians, but the problem was that the other party would not believe them. Therefore, in the end, Fry only vaguely said that his 3rd Army Battalion was patrolling and was attacked by barbarians. They could only retreat here and suffered heavy losses along the way. There were only a few of them left here. This was naturally believable because it was the truth. Furthermore, after going through the ravine for more than 10 days, everyone looked no different from barbarians. This was also the reason why Barthas and the others were so close before putting down their weapons. After hearing Frey's words, Barthas nodded and looked at everyone. He lamented, "We've all heard about the situation in the wilderness. Barbarians are everywhere. More than 1,000 of you traversed the wilderness. It's already a miracle that so many of you survived and made it here." Fry and the others could not help but smile bitterly. Who knew that if it were not for the wilderness wolf riders, there would be more of them who would have made it here alive. Barthas misunderstood their expressions and consoled them. "Don't be too sad. Dying on the battlefield is also the end of a soldier. The next time you see the barbarians, kill a few of them and take it as revenge for them." Even though he had misunderstood the situation, his words made sense. Tang En and the others nodded in agreement. Then, Eltek changed the topic and asked casually, "Brother Barthas, you don't seem surprised that we're here at all?" "Haha, of course." Barthas raised his head and laughed. He explained, "Brothers, you may not know this, but you're not the first group to come here. A few days ago, there were often other teams from the Thunderbolt's army hiding in our defense area. However, you're the first to traverse the wilderness with only 1,000 of you. Basically, the ones who came here were divisions. I heard that there were a few generals who suffered heavy losses." Barthas' words were full of pride. It was probably because the Zechen Legion was strong enough to become a shelter. However, this was understandable because it was the truth. Fry and the others nodded in realization. Yes, they were not the only ones who thought of running here. Considering the situation in the wilderness at that time, this was indeed the most suitable shelter when the situation was unfavorable. "Oh right." Fry seemed to have thought of something and quickly said, "When we came here we saw tens of thousands of barbarians. What's going on?" Barthas grinned. "Oh them. Haha. They've been here for almost a week. They've only been tearing down our abandoned military strongholds. They don't dare to go deeper." Fry was surprised. "Abandoned?" Barthas nodded. "Yes, there hasn't been a real battle here for a few years. Some of the buildings in the strongholds are seriously old and dilapidated. We're also having a headache. Let's tear them down. This is a huge project. We're also a little reluctant to do so. After all, they can still be used. If we don't tear them down, we can't build new ones." Barthas scratched his head to express his distress. Then, he smiled happily. "But it's good now. These barbarians spent a week tearing down most of the buildings. It saved us a lot of trouble." Tang En, Fry and the others looked at each other. They were all speechless. Then, they collectively made a gesture in front of their chest to mourn for the tens of thousands of barbarians that they had just seen. However, Barthas still seemed a little dissatisfied. He touched the sword at his waist. "Of course, it's because our commanding officer ordered us not to attack. Otherwise, we wouldn't have let these barbarians wander around our defense area. Forget it, there's no point in talking about this. Well, your luck is not bad." Fortunately, you didn't encounter those tens of thousands of barbarians. Haha, yes, fortunately we didn't encounter them. Frey's smile was a little stiff. He and Tang En looked at each other and the corners of their mouths twitched. Then, they changed the topic. I saw that those barbarians were in a hurry. It seemed like they were running for their lives. Did you guys do something? Is there such a thing? Barthes scratched his head and shook his head. I'm not too sure about this. But this may be an important piece of information. I'll report it to my superiors after I send you to the checkpoint. Well, thank you, brothers. Barthes was only a battalion commander and was still patrolling. Obviously, he hadn't received any orders from his superiors. Naturally, he didn't know about this. Haha, Brother Barthes is too polite. We just happened to see it and casually mentioned it. We don't deserve your thanks. As they chatted, a faint outline of a checkpoint appeared before their eyes before the sky turned completely dark. There were a few flickering flames on the walls. With Barthes leading the way, they entered the checkpoint after a simple search by the soldiers guarding the city. The checkpoints in the Bran were similar. What they saw were all defensive equipment and patrolling soldiers. It was the same here. There wouldn't be any special equipment just because they were from the Zechen Legion. After sending them to the inner gate of the checkpoint, Barthes pointed to the soldier beside him and said, "Now, brothers, you just need to follow him. Well, it's just a simple registration. Then, they will open a passage for you. It's just a routine procedure." "Okay, thank you, Brother Barthes. We'll treat you to a drink when we have time." "Haha, that's great. I'll be waiting." After exchanging a few pleasantries, Barthes turned and strode away. However, he didn't go to the wilderness outside. Instead, he went to a certain place inside the checkpoint. He was probably going to report the information that the barbarians had retreated. Tang En and the others followed the soldier to the left. After walking for a short distance, a house made of thick stones appeared in front of them. The soldier who led the way opened the door and said a few words with a smile. He seemed to have a good relationship with the people inside. Then, he waved his hand and invited them in. The so-called registration was similar to what Tang En and the others had to write down their military ranks and the legion they belonged to. Then, the other party would check and confirm that there were no mistakes. They would then open a passage for them. With this passage, they would be able to travel through the cities behind them. Of course, the other party would also provide them with food and lodging until they left this defensive area and returned to their legion. This kind of work should only be done by Frey, Eltek, and Taka. However, Tang En's position was closer to the front, so the soldier who led the way treated him as an officer and invited him in. Tang En only knew about this after he came in. He rubbed his nose and didn't pay much attention to it. He consciously stood to the side. Then, out of boredom, he looked around the office of the checkpoint. To be honest, it was very simple. There was only a table and a few benches. The only eye-catching thing was the wooden cabinet at the back that looked like a bookcase. After Frey and the others registered, a soldier opened the cabinet and took out a stack of papers. Tang En's eyes were sharp. He saw the handwriting of the 4 armies of thunder on the papers. He suddenly realized that this was the proof that the other party had checked. Probably noticing Tang En's gaze, Frey came over and explained, "The Bran military will record all the active military officers. Of course, this is only a checkpoint, so it can only be above the battalion level. Also, it only has simple information such as names. When we enter the cities behind us, we will go through another registration. Then, the inspection will be more detailed." Tang En nodded in understanding. After all, this place was close to the front lines. Moreover, it was a time of war. Naturally, the management would not be sloppy. Just as he was about to open his mouth to say something, unexpectedly, after the initial shock, the sound of pages flipping could be heard. Tang En and Frey subconsciously turned their heads. They saw Eltek's body trembling violently. He was almost unable to move. Taka, who was next to him, poked his head over. In an instant, he had the same reaction. Because the two of them had their backs facing each other, Tang En did not know what was going on. However, from the strong body movements, Tang En had reason to believe that their faces were filled with shock. At this time, Eltek had already turned around. He was holding a book in his hands. It should be the book that they had just registered. He took a few big steps and walked in front of Tang En and Fry. He pointed at a page and said with a strange expression, "Look." Tang En lowered his head. There were lines of handwriting on the page. Some of the strokes were like dragons and snake. Their strength penetrated the back of the paper. Some of the strokes were like earthworms. They were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. It was pure and natural. As for the position that Eltek's carrot-like short finger was pointing at, the handwriting was excellent. It seemed to be quite powerful. The content was, Deputy General of Thunder's Third Army, Wiener. Wiener? It sounds a little familiar. Before Tang En could react, a hoarse voice that had suppressed its anger to the extreme sounded beside his ear. Read Mao Itachi. Chapter 534. Life was often more exciting than novels and dramas. Just like candy, before the wrapper was removed, one would never know what kind of sweet or bitter taste would greet one's taste bud. It was normal to enter the city and register when going to someone else's territory. But just as the soldiers were busy looking through the information, and Ayrton was flipping through the registration book out of boredom, he found a name that made him both surprised and angry: Wiener. Without any rest, Fry and the rest forgot about their promise to treat Barthes to a drink. After asking the soldiers who were in charge of the office, the troops left the city that very night and rushed to the rear. This night was destined to be a restless one. At the leftmost checkpoint of the Thunderbolts' army's defensive zone, Tu, who was leading tens of thousands of barbarians, clashed with the Zechen Legion soldiers who had just taken down the checkpoint. On a narrow path, one was tightening the encirclement, while the other was rushing to break through and escape. Without any hesitation, the two sides immediately clashed, and the sounds of battle shook the sky. Immediately after, many Zechen Legion soldiers rushed out from the surrounding mountains and joined in the encirclement. From the very beginning, the battle had entered a white-hot state where bayonets could see red. In the beginning, the few thousand Zechen Legion soldiers who had taken down the checkpoint were at a disadvantage. This was inevitable, as they didn't expect the barbarians to arrive so quickly. They didn't even have time to rest at the checkpoint that they had just taken down. The city walls were broken, and there were only a few intact defensive equipment. It was basically useless. Under such circumstances, they were naturally at a disadvantage against the barbarians who were several times stronger than them. Fortunately, this situation didn't last long. Just as the barbarian vanguard rushed into the checkpoint, the Zechen Legion soldiers who were lying in ambush rushed out and surrounded the tens of thousands of barbarians at the back. At this point, the outcome of the battle was clear. The barbarians were bound to break through. The only difference was the time it would take for the barbarians to break through and the number of casualties. Tu was very clear about this point, but seeing the Zechen Legion soldiers seizing the opportunity to isolate and kill the barbarians at the back, his heart was still bleeding. This time, the ambush on the Purple Star Army was a failure, and also a joke. Although he had led his troops around the Zechen Legion's defensive zone for a week and destroyed more than half of the enemy's military strongholds, he seemed invincible and mighty. But in reality, the number of enemy soldiers destroyed was extremely small. But now the other party had used a small trick to deal a heavy blow to the other side. The difference in strength was obvious. Of course, no matter how unwilling he was, Tu could only lead as many people as possible to retreat. Moreover, at this moment, he couldn't help but rejoice in his heart. Fortunately, the news from the trump card was timely. Otherwise, this side would have been completely wiped out. The battle continued for about half the night. In the end, Tiu abandoned more than 1,000 barbarian warriors, and led his troops to break out of the encirclement. Then, he rushed towards the boundless wilderness under the dark curtain. At about dawn, a piece of information was sent to the center of the grand border city through a hidden channel. It was sent to an exaggeratedly warm room. The room was as messy as always, filled with all kinds of documents and maps. In the corner, there were many burning charcoal furnaces, almost turning the room into a blazing volcano. Only Z in his purple robe was in the room. He sat quietly and looked at the information on the table. If Tang En, Fry, Eltek, and even Barthas were here, they would definitely be familiar with this information. This was because this was the information that Barthas had sent to his superiors. The content was very simple. On a certain day, at noon, a group that came here to seek refuge found traces of tens of thousands of barbarians near the mountain range. The barbarians were retreating in a hurry. Time, place, and event. Everything was very simple, just like the insignificant information sent back by the scouts during an army's march. But this simple information, if it fell into the eyes of someone who knew the inside story, such as Z, they would immediately realize that something was wrong. The time wasn't right. The plan to encircle and annihilate the barbarians was only 2 days ago. Thus, there were only two possibilities. First, the barbarians had a keen sense of smell and immediately chose to retreat when they sensed that something was wrong. Second, there was a spy who leaked the plan to the barbarians. Cough, cough. Continuous coughing broke the silence in the room. After a while, Z put down his hand that was covering his mouth. His expression was neither happy nor sad, and no one could tell what he was feeling. He then took a deep breath, reached out and crumpled the piece of paper into a ball, and threw it lightly into the furnace not far away. The piece of paper quickly turned yellow, curled, and turned into black ashes in the fire. He sighed. "I'm a coward, don't force me." The sky was slightly bright. In a small city within the Zichan Legion's defense zone. Fry and the others were travel-worn. After confirming their identities, they walked out of the office and nodded at Tang En, who was waiting outside. The group continued to move forward and crossed the city. At this time, the city was still in a deep sleep. The wide roads were covered by a light morning fog, and there was basically no one in sight. The route is correct. He's still in front of us. But he's getting close. We should be able to catch up by noon. After a night of running, Fry had already calmed down and explained the situation calmly. Tang En nodded and smiled. "Haha, this is called searching high and low for something, only to find it without any effort. And when do you plan to make a move?" "The sooner the better." Fry pursed his lips, and a murderous look flashed across his face. He narrowed his eyes and said, "I've already asked around." He came out with a division of soldiers, but he suffered heavy losses. There are only about 1,000 people left. Now we're in the dark and they're in the light. As long as we plan well and go straight into the middle of the army, the chances of success are very high. Fry was still a rational person. After a short moment of hot-headedness, he quickly sorted out the pros and cons of both sides and made the decision to make a move as soon as possible. He wasn't in a hurry to take revenge, or even if he was, it wasn't all. After all, Winard was a lieutenant general. If he returned to the Thunderbolts' army's defense zone, it would be difficult for them to make a move. Then what else is there to say? Let's hurry up and kill him. Taka tightened his grip on the short battle axe in his hand. His murderous look was overflowing. Whether it was for his saviors like Tang En and Fry, or for the soldiers on his side that were almost completely wiped out, Taka had enough reason to take revenge. Eltek was the same. He opened his eyes wide and said gruffly, "That's right. Brother Fry, give the order. What should we do?" Fry shook his head and said calmly, "No, it's what we should do. As for you guys, stay in the city and leave in 3 hours." "What? Impossible!" Eltek and Taka instantly lost their voice. They couldn't believe their ears. Then, they said anxiously, "Brother Fry, what do you mean?" "Yes, we don't have a lot of people, but even if we have to be bait or cannon fodder, I have no complaints." "That's right. And Brother Fry, this isn't just about you. My dead brothers are still buried in the wilderness. If I can't kill Winard with my own hands, how am I going to answer to them when I go to hell?" Fry waved his hand. "Don't get too worked up. Let me finish." Fry calmed the two people down and said calmly, "We've been through life and death together for so many days. You guys are my life and death brothers. If the situation allows, I won't leave you guys behind to take revenge. But the situation is different now. After we kill Winard, we'll turn ourselves in. At this time, we need someone to stand out and testify for us and tell us what happened in the wilderness." Pause for a while patted Eltek and Taka's shoulders. "And this person can only be an outsider. If they're involved, no one will believe what they say. So, I asked you guys to stay in the city for a few hours just to show your faces and give others the impression that we're not close and that we're parting ways." "Yes, please." Eltek and Taka were silent at the same time. They knew that Fry was right. Although the Grey Coat Army and Blank's army were working together, the relationship between the soldiers on both sides was not good. Take them for example. If it weren't for Tang En and the others saving their lives time and time again and knowing Frey's true identity, they wouldn't have been on the brink of death together. They might not have been on good terms with each other. Their relationship was tense when they first met. They even mocked and ridiculed each other. So, it was undoubtedly the best strategy to have them testify. Of course, this was on the premise that they didn't participate in what happened next. Otherwise, as the parties involved, no matter what they said, others would preemptively think that they were in cahoots. After understanding this, Eltek and Taka could only nod helplessly. They told everyone to stab Winard a few more times as revenge for them. Then, they sent Tang En and the others out of the city. Stepping on the official road outside the city, everyone's face suddenly turned cold. No one was allowed to come near them. Skinny Monkey, Bamboo Pole, Big Bear, and Frey's old brothers were needless to say. Under the new and old grudges, they couldn't wait to chop Winard up. Although the other soldiers of the Spear Breaker army joined later, whether it was because of the grudge between Fry and the others, they had a common enemy, or because of the brothers who had died in the previous escape, they were all red-eyed. While running in silence, Fry suddenly turned his head and said, "Tang, with our friendship, there shouldn't be any need to say anything, but now you're involved, since there's no need to say it, then don't say it." Tang En obviously knew what Fry was thinking. He interrupted him and said, "I was the one who advised you to join the Grey Coat Army. Of course I'm responsible. Besides, you know me. I don't have a big heart, but I'm a vengeful person. That red-haired weasel almost killed me and almost buried me and the entire gray space in the wilderness. Naturally, I have to get back at him." After a brief explanation, Tang En changed the topic and smiled. "Let me interview you, Brother Fry. Back then, you led people to attack thousands of miles and cut off the head of the gilded aristocrat. Now you're attacking hundreds of miles to chop Winard. Do you feel different?" "Interview?" Fry was slightly stunned, then he shook his head and smiled bitterly. "It's about the same. It's like going through a reincarnation cycle. The difference is that the person I killed is different, and I'm still as impulsive. Haha, that's the rhythm. I like this kind of impulsiveness." "Yes, me too." Ha. Chapter 535. At noon, the sky was high and the clouds were light. On top of a large city wall, a soldier squatting on a tall watchtower suddenly squinted his eyes. He saw many vague figures neatly lined up at the end of the official road. He didn't panic. Of course, there was no need for that. This was the Zechen Legion's defense area, so it was very safe. Even if there were enemies, there should be someone in front to report back in advance. Sure enough, when they got closer, a few small figures in the group ran up a mound. Then, a few eye-catching flags of different colors were waved continuously. Friendly forces safe. Thunder Legion, division level, more than 1,300 people. Oh, another one who came to seek refuge. The soldier squinted his eyes and interpreted the meaning of the flag signal in a low voice. Of course, the last sentence was pure ridicule. There were no telephones in the other world. Civilian communication was basically through shouting. However, the army obviously couldn't do that. The intelligence of people was infinite. Therefore, the scouts who specialized in transmitting information and the flag signal now were all methods of communication. Flag signals were suitable for short to medium distance. For a group of more than 1,000 people to enter the city, there was no doubt that it was better to greet first to avoid any misunderstandings. Just as the soldier on the lookout was looking over here, two people riding horses in the group were also looking at the city in the distance. If there was someone who knew about Brand's military rank here, they would be able to recognize from the insignia on their arms that they were a deputy general and a division commander. Both of them looked middle-aged. Judging from their appearance and temperament, the deputy general should be slightly older than the division commander. Of course, this was only a guess. The main reason was that although the deputy general had a head of non-mainstream dark red curly hair, his appearance was dignified and calm. On the other hand, the division commander was emitting a murderous aura. However, the calm deputy general seemed a little absent-minded. Although his eyes were staring at the city in the distance, there was no focus. The division commander beside him didn't notice at first. Later, when he saw the deputy general maintain the posture for a long time, he realized that he was absent-minded. He coughed twice and said, "General, we are here." "Yes." The deputy general nodded slightly, still absent-minded. Seeing this, the division master came closer and said, "General, you don't have to worry. The previous battle was a result of the current situation. No one would have thought that the barbarians would rush over like mad dogs. When we go back and reassemble our forces, we will definitely be able to fight a beautiful comeback and vent our frustrations." The deputy general finally came back to his senses and said with a non-committal smile, "Haha, all right, I'll wait to see you make a comeback." The division commander knew that he had guessed wrongly. Then, he raised his eyebrows as if he had thought of something. He lowered his voice and said, "General, are you thinking about that arrogant guy, Before he finished speaking, the deputy general suddenly turned his head, as if his thoughts had been read. His eyes were as sharp as a knife. But when he saw the middle-aged teacher's stunned expression, his eyes dimmed and he shook his head gently. I'm old. Myson, you've been with me for decades, so you know what happened back then. Well, I don't know what's going on these past few days, but I keep having the feeling that that fellow will suddenly jump out and stab me with a gun. Perhaps the older I get, the more cowardly I become." "Haha, General, you're joking. You're at the peak of your power. Not long ago, when you broke out of the encirclement, you cut off the head of a barbarian who blocked your way with a knife. You're not old at all." The middle-aged division commander called Myson shook his head and laughed. There was no trace of flattery in his expression. Then, he pondered for a moment and said casually, "General, you don't have to worry too much. No matter how that arrogant guy escaped back then, since he didn't obediently find a place to hide and conceal his identity, instead, he dares to swagger to the front line. He's looking for death." Pause for a while. This Myson really lived up to his appearance and temperament. The moment he opened his mouth, he was filled with a bloody and murderous aura. And he also deserves to die. He was recognized by Grey Eagle, who was the archery instructor behind him. This is the will of God. He wants us to attack again and send him to hell. Although because of this damned barbarian we lost contact with Colorado. But if I'm not wrong, I'm afraid that he's already dead in the wilderness. His flesh and blood were eaten by the vultures. Not even his bones are left. Speaking of Colorado, This red-haired lieutenant was naturally the red-haired weasel that Fry and the others had mentioned. Hearing Myson's confident words, he didn't show any excitement or joy. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the city wall that was getting closer and closer. His expression was somewhat reminiscent. It's too early to say this. Fry isn't someone who gives up easily, and he's not someone who's easy to deal with. Well, actually, I've always admired him, and even somewhat admired him. If it wasn't for fate playing tricks on us and letting us be assigned to the same division at the same time, we would have been able to be compared. I believe that we would have become good friends, and even brothers who would entrust our lives to each other on the battlefield. It's a pity that we're destined to only be enemies. And he's too outstanding. So outstanding that the people around him can't even shine a little bit. They can only curl up and squat in his shadow. At this point, there was a hint of resentment in Wyson's words. He probably realized it himself, so he shut his mouth and slowed down. Myson nodded silently. He and Grey Eagle, who had been transferred to the rear as an archery instructor, were old men who had followed Wyson for decades. They were also members of the Squall Daggers back then, so they naturally knew how Wyson felt. In fact, when they compared themselves to the soldiers of the Thunder Spear formation breaking team, how could they not feel the same way? Of course, it's meaningless to talk about this now. Wyson shook his head slightly. Since he's already an enemy, then naturally, we have to kill him by any means necessary. This is like spilled water, it's impossible to take it back. The only thing we can do now is to sprinkle some dust and completely bury the traces of water. Don't worry, General. Myson raised his head slightly, the murderous look on his face becoming more intense. This is no longer Frey's era. Even if that brat Colorado didn't kill him, with our current position, we have plenty of opportunities to play him to death. Wyson didn't object this time and nodded slightly. That was the truth. Wyson was now a deputy general, while Fry was only a battalion commander from the Grey Coat Army. No matter how one looked at it, there was no suspense. However, he still said cautiously, "This matter has to be resolved as soon as possible. He might not know that I was the one behind the scenes in the past, but he was the one who killed that noble. If we interrogate him and spread it, it will be a big problem." He paused, as if he had thought of something, and continued, "Oh, there's more. Although Fry isn't a big threat to us now, we can't underestimate him. That lunatic Baylor was his subordinate back then. If he knows that Fry isn't dead, we won't have any more opportunities to act." Most people in the Thunderbolt's army knew that Baylor had participated in the encirclement of the Grey Coat Army last year. However, no one had heard of Baylor's encounter with Fry. The reason for this was, of course, because Baylor hadn't spread it after returning. After all, the relationship between the Grey Coat Army and the Bran was very tense. If Frey's identity was exposed, it would draw hatred. As for now, Baylor really didn't know that Fry had come to the front lines. Otherwise, with his status, how could he have let Fry and the others go to the front lines in the wilderness to be cannon fodder? Understood. Mason nodded. Baylor was a general, one level higher than Wyson. Of course, they had to avoid him carefully. "General, don't worry. When we return this time, I'll immediately investigate all the news about Fry. After so many years, they're still in the light, and we're still in the dark." Last time, he was able to run thousands of miles to kill that retarded noble. Will he be able to run over and kill us this time? These mocking words made Wyson's lips curl up, and he laughed softly. At this time, the advancing troops had reached the city gate. The soldiers guarding the city had already received the news from the watchtower. They politely went forward to verify the passage, and then waved their hands to let them pass. However, at this time, suddenly, a commotion came from behind. Wyson turned his head in shock and then frowned. He saw a small troop rushing to the city gate at the same time. Looking at the style of their armor, they were actually from the Thunderbolt's army. However, they looked very anxious, and their actions were barbaric and violent. They even broke through the formation here and forced their way to the city gate. Normally, it was a taboo for the army to cross and crash into the formation of other troops for no reason. This involved the soldiers' sense of honor. If they weren't careful, it would lead to a group fight. It was no wonder that Weisson frowned and was somewhat dissatisfied when he saw this. The soldiers guarding the city had already gone over, but the negotiation wasn't very smooth. They saw a big man holding up a passage and roaring loudly, "Get out of the way, all of you get out of the way. We have people here who are injured and want to enter the city for treatment now. How dare you block me?" Scram! Weisson understood. They were rushing to send injured soldiers into the city for treatment. In such a hurry, the other party naturally couldn't care about anything else. Mason's face darkened when he saw this. "Damn, which troop are these bastards from? How dare they rush to my division? Forget it." Waving his hand, Weisson was magnanimous. He moved his horse to the side and said, "Disperse, let them go in first." Stopping injured soldiers from entering the city for treatment was unreasonable no matter where it was spread. Although with Weisson's rank, the other party couldn't do anything if he really wanted to go in first, it was obviously better not to do something like this that would ruin his reputation. Mason knew this too, so even though he was somewhat dissatisfied, he still waved his hand and got his soldiers to disperse to the sides and open up a path straight to the city gate. Very quickly, the group of hurried soldiers at the back walked into the center of the formation and approached Weisson and the rest. Weisson suddenly frowned. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but he felt that some of the soldiers were looking in his direction. Their gazes were somewhat familiar. Mason didn't care. He saw that these soldiers were covered in blood and mud, and were in a terrible state. Some of them were even carried on simple stretchers. He couldn't help but smack his lips. TSK, these injuries are not light injuries. A bolt of lightning suddenly flashed across Mason's mind. His scalp went numb, and his face changed drastically. No. This is the Zechen Legion's defense zone. Where did they get injured? Before he finished speaking, a green-edged spear was suddenly raised in the middle of the formation. Lightning overflowed and shone on the spot. Then, an angry roar exploded. Attack! The familiar spear, the familiar electric aura. Wiener's pupils constricted violently, and a chill ran down his spine to his brain. He lost his voice and exclaimed, "Fry!" Chapter 536. Fry! Someone screamed in horror. This city was within the Zechen Legion's defense zone. There were no traces of barbarians, so it was impossible for so many people to be injured. Even if there were people who were injured for other reasons, they shouldn't be from the Thunderbolt's army. Wiener's reaction was fast, but he was still a step too late. The other party was already in front of him. Bang, bang, bang. A few soldiers flew out in an instant. A figure burst out from the middle and broke through the obstacles. The electric spear was like a dragon swimming in the sky, and it instantly charged towards Wiener. "How dare you!" A roar was heard, and a blade swiftly blocked from the side. It was Mason. He was standing in front of Wiener on the left. Everything happened in an instant, and he didn't hear what Wiener shouted. He subconsciously raised his blade to block. Clang! Sparks flew everywhere, and there was a loud bang. Mason's blade was blocked by a large sword that came from the sky, and the sword was repelled at the same time. It was the burly man who roared with the road ticket. He pulled back his sword and slashed again. "Haha, don't meddle in other people's business. Your opponent is me." With this delay, the spear-wielding figure had already swept away the soldiers blocking the road and was in front of Wiener. Their eyes met and the spear stabbed out. "Red-haired weasel, do you still remember me?" Fry. This time, he was close. The nightmare in his heart overlapped with reality. Wiener finally confirmed that the person in front of him was Fry, who should have died many times. Without thinking, his face darkened. He pressed on the horse's back and retreated in the air. In his line of sight, the electric spear pierced nothing and was instantly retracted. It was covered by the horse. The next moment, hiss! As soon as Wiener landed, a large shadow pressed down on him. When he looked up, he saw that his horse was in the middle and couldn't help but neigh. Clang! The long blade was unsheathed, and the light of the blade soared into the sky. Whoosh! The light of the blade instantly sank into the horse's body. Bang! The blade cut the horse in half. The two halves of the horse flew to one side, and a pool of blood appeared in the middle. Then it exploded, drenching the soldiers below. The stench of horse blood instantly filled the place. Good timing! With the power of this strike, Wiener stepped forward and raised his head, his hair and beard fluttering. Fry, you dared to provoke a civil war in the army. Today you will die. As expected of an ambitious and ruthless character. After a brief moment of shock, Venard quickly calmed down and immediately pinned a huge accusation on the other party, deciding to counterattack. Hee hee, Red Weasel. It's been so many years, but you haven't changed at all. His voice came and went from east to west. It was impossible to tell which direction he was coming from. You really surprised me and disappointed me at the same time. Die. As soon as he finished speaking, Fry once again flashed out from the gap between the soldiers. His face was calm and his eyes were firm. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the spear shadows surged like a tide. Ha ha! Wiener let out a long laugh. The fighting aura around his body burst out violently. The saber light was like a gale as it charged forward. You haven't changed. You are still so impulsive and reckless. Kill me? With just you and these few people? Clang, 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 sounds of collisions rang out like a torrential downpour of pear blossoms. Both of them fought with speed. Their spears and sabers were almost invisible. Afterimages were everywhere as they constantly crossed each other. In terms of fighting aura, Venard firmly suppressed Fry. His initial passive situation was quickly reversed. This result was inevitable. Although Fry was talented, he had been in the mines for so many years and had never undergone systematic and stable training. His strength was naturally inferior. However, the spear had a natural advantage in attack and defense. Furthermore, Fry was extremely experienced in fighting. It was still possible for him to maintain a stalemate for a short period of time. Ha ha! Laughing wildly, Venard quickly tightened the net of sabers. Seeing that it was difficult to take down Fry in a short period of time, he said forcefully, "Is that all you have left? The once famous lightning spear Fry seems like this is all there is to it now." "What about you?" Frey's calm voice was heard. "I haven't seen you for more than 10 years, and your strength is still only a high-level warrior. In comparison, you are the one who is more embarrassed." Pause for a while, he pursed his lips and changed his stance to defense. "Do you know why?" "Oh right, you are a smart person. Of course you know. You just don't want to admit it." He answered his own question. "Let me expose you. You have fallen long ago. You no longer have the ambition of the past. You are used to taking shortcuts. You are used to using underhanded methods to achieve success." He dodged the saber light that suddenly became sharper. His shoulder was only grazed, and a piece of flesh was immediately cut off. Fry acted as if he did not feel it. His expression did not change. "I dare to conclude that your achievements in this life will only be like this until you die. Just like you are now only a deputy general. You are one level lower than Baylor." Every sentence pierced the heart. Every word dripped blood. Venard, who had provoked an outside attack, instantly became gloomy. His attack became more severe. His expression was ferocious and distorted. "You are still so arrogant. You still have that annoying lecturing tone. Who do you think you are? Fry, the result will decide everything. You fought with your life on the battlefield before. Wasn't it just to raise your military rank and obtain glory? Look at me. My achievements now are enough for you to look up to. Retreating a few steps, his spear drew an arc, achievements, obtained by flattery and backstabbing your comrades. Bullshit. There were outsiders here. Naturally, Venard could not admit it. Saber light flashed as he pressed forward step by step. The winner takes all. It has been like this since ancient times. Today I am strong and have many soldiers. I want to kill you on the spot. This is the truth. Oh! Fry curled his lips and said sarcastically, then take a closer look. Look at your so-called soldiers. Venard's heart trembled when he heard this. He subconsciously looked to the side. His expression immediately became extremely ugly. They were fighting in the center of the division. Because of the overflowing fighting aura, no soldiers dared to stay by the side. Instead, a large open space was cleared. On the outside, Venard didn't see his own subordinates at first glance. Instead, he saw Frere's soldiers wearing tattered armor. The other side had unknowingly completed the encirclement of this place and formed a solid defensive line, completely blocking his soldiers on the outside. Moreover, among the soldiers outside, dozens of black-armored men with short blades were constantly weaving in and out. Their attacks were ruthless and decisive. Everywhere they went, there was almost no enemy. Their strength was obviously higher than ordinary soldiers, and if one looked carefully, they would be able to see that they did not kill. They only injured but did not kill. In this way, not only did they reduce the fighting power of the soldiers here, they also blocked the path of reinforcements behind them. As for Mason, he was now being held back by a big man with a big sword. He did not have the chance to organize the soldiers at all. Damn it, where did Fry find this group of people? Venard had been on the front line for so many years. Naturally, his eyes were sharp. Those soldiers with long spears were not bad. Although their fighting power was not bad and their cooperation was very good, they were definitely not to the point where they could block more than 1,000 elite soldiers. The key was that group of black-armored men. It was because of their troublemaking that his soldiers could not successfully charge over. Die. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Just as Venard was distracted, Frey's eyes flashed with a sharp light. He instantly changed his defensive spear stance, completely ignoring the snowflakes in front of him. As if gambling with his life, the lightning spear shadow with the power of thousands of soldiers pounced forward. Venard was shocked. After a moment of hesitation, he saw Fry, who was covered in blood, pass through the blade light. His eyes were like a tiger's, and he could not help but take a step back subconsciously. **T. After taking a step back, Venard immediately cursed in his heart. His blade technique was swift and fierce, especially when he attacked quickly. Each strike was faster than the last, and it was so fast that people could not breathe. It was also because of this that they were called the fierce gale daggers. But just as the saying went, hard is easy to break, he was not good at defense. Now that Fry had successfully broken through the blade light with his life on the line, what followed would be a storm of attacks. If he could hold on, Fry would die. If he could not, he would die. In an instant, the situation of the battle changed from a small advantage to one that was confusing and unpredictable. Sure enough, Frey's figure had completely disappeared in the endless spear shadows. One could only hear a roar louder than the last. The intensity of the attacks was like a huge wave crashing onto a table, each stronger than the last. Venard's figure was almost instantly covered by the spear shadows. But as expected of an ambitious person, Venard knew that he had made a mistake. He did not continue to choose to retreat conservatively. Instead, he waved his blade and attacked directly, wanting to use his powerful strength to turn the situation around. In an instant, the scene was filled with continuous explosions. The battle light wantonly crisscrossed, and dust filled the air. The spear shadows soared up like thunder from the ninth heaven, unstoppable. The sword light and snowflakes flew like a gale, wreaking havoc in an area. Cha! Aren't you hurting people? Hurry up and retreat. No, beat them out of here. Looking at the rolling battle light, Tang En, who was part-time as a commander, was greatly alarmed. Of course, he wasn't afraid of the scattered battle energy, but the ordinary soldiers couldn't. He immediately ordered the soldiers around him to expand the encirclement in a flurry. "Boss, should we help Brother Fry?" Luke asked loudly as he looked at the intense battle behind him. Tang En turned his head and narrowed his eyes. He waved his hand and said, "It's revenge. Of course, it feels good to do it yourself. It's not good for others to interfere. Look, even David has retreated. Shem, trust Brother Fry and the others." Not far away, David had indeed retreated. Now, Thin Monkey, Bamboo Pole, Big Bear and the other veterans were taking turns to besiege Mason. Perhaps because they knew each other from before, they teased and mocked Mason while taking turns to fight him. Mason was so angry that he roared, but couldn't get rid of them no matter what. "Ha, these veterans!" Luke couldn't help but laugh when he saw that. He then suddenly drew his bow and turned around. Swoosh! The arrow hit the thigh of a soldier who had raised his sword and was about to launch a sneak attack from behind. With a scream, the soldier immediately threw away his weapon and rolled around on the ground, hugging his thigh. Everybody had already made a plan before they came. As the saying went, every wrong had its perpetrator, and every debt had its debtor. Frey's goal was to take revenge on Venal, and later on Mason, an acquaintance they had just discovered. Other than that, they wouldn't kill the ordinary soldiers if they could, in case they brought unnecessary trouble. Of course, not killing them didn't mean that they would just stand there and let others kill them. Luke had stayed in the middle to provide support in case something like that happened. David, who had retreated, waved his sword and greeted them cheerfully. "Haha, boss, that guy is pretty strong. If it weren't for Brother Thin Monkey and the others. F***ck, Brother Fry hasn't taken care of him yet? Alright, let me go and kill that red hair. What was it again?" Seeing the intense battle behind them, David immediately perked up. He rolled up his sleeves and was about to charge forward with his sword. Thankfully, Luke was quick enough to grab him, and explained the reason to him. Scratching his head, David finally gave up on helping, but he was still a little confused. "Since he's an enemy, why don't you just kill him? Why do you have to make it so complicated?" Tang En and Luke looked at each other and smiled bitterly. Neither of them was interested in explaining the intricacies of the situation to David. Well, it would be pointless to explain, so they simply pretended that they didn't hear anything. Right at that moment, all of a sudden, beep, 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 several shrill whistles of varying lengths rang out from the periphery. Tang En subconsciously turned his head and saw that Zechen Legion soldiers were gathering at the city gate. More and more archers were starting to appear on the city walls. Needless to say, the city garrison had been mobilized. After all, this was the Zechen Legion's defensive zone, and it was right at the city gate. But now, the two teams of Thunderbolt's army soldiers were having a great time fighting each other. What was going on? The reason why they had only mobilized now was mainly because Tang En's actions were too sudden and unexpected. When Fry shouted for them to attack, the city garrison soldiers who were standing on the side were dumbfounded. They thought that the barbarians were attacking in disguise. By the time they realized what was going on, Tang En and the others had already charged into the enemy's camp, and the two sides were completely entangled. The city garrison soldiers didn't know the complicated reason behind this. They only thought that the two teams had some minor friction, and even stepped forward to separate them. In the end, Frey's men were too eager for revenge to pay them any attention. Winard's soldiers were even more depressed. They had kindly made way for the other side, but not only did the other side not thank them, they were even making false accusations. Who wouldn't be angry? Also, these city garrison soldiers weren't trying to pull the other side away, but were trying to stop them instead. They were clearly siding with the other side. With this thought in mind, he naturally made a move without holding back. Fortunately, Winard's soldiers still had some sense. They knew that they were in someone else's territory, so they didn't kill them. They only chased the unlucky city garrison soldiers away. At that moment, the city garrison soldiers finally realized that things had gotten out of hand. They hurriedly blew the whistle and prepared to intervene by force. Seeing this, Luke frowned. "Boss, we don't have much time." The so-called intervention by force wasn't a joke. If they didn't obey the order, they would be killed on the spot. Also, there was basically no way to reason with them afterward. Pondering for a moment, Tang En said in a low voice, "Tell everyone to get ready. Once the Zichen Legion soldiers come in to intervene, gather together and cooperate with them to retreat." "Okay, David, tell Skinny Monkey and the others to stop playing around. Hurry up." "Haha, okay." David nodded knowingly. A hint of killing intent flashed across his face as he turned around and walked toward Mason. Luke, on the other hand, quickly ran around the encirclement and relayed the order. Looking back at Fry and Winard, who were still locked in an intense battle, Tang En frowned slightly. Then, he raised his head and looked at the rows of soldiers standing on the wall with their bows drawn. He raised his eyebrows and nodded slightly. The intervention by force came very quickly. Not far away, a sorrowful roar suddenly rang out. Just as Mason, whose body was full of holes, fell down unwillingly, rows of Zichen Legion soldiers rushed out of the city gate. After looking around, they directly chose the most intense part of the battle and charged in. These Zichen Legion soldiers were all wearing heavy armor and holding shields. As soon as they charged in, it was as if an iron chain was constantly extending across the river, directly separating the soldiers on both sides. The soldiers of the Lance Destroyer formation had already received the order. Seeing this, they immediately gathered together and were very cooperative. Of course, there were also some old ruffians like Skinny Monkey who didn't care about etiquette. They took the opportunity to sneak in a few sneak attacks, then retreated with smiles as the enemy roared and screamed. Compared to the calm retreat on this side, Winard's soldiers were especially furious and irritable. This was inevitable. After all, their division commander Mason had been stabbed to death just now. How could they not take revenge for such a huge grudge? Thus, they completely ignored these Zichen Legion soldiers who had come to intervene and risked their lives to take revenge. In the end, the Lance Destroyer formation soldiers, who had obediently retreated to a corner and were surrounded by the Zichen Legion soldiers who came later, excitedly watched the fight between Winard's soldiers and the heavy armor soldiers. When they saw the exciting parts, they would even cheer from time to time, leisurely and contented. Whether it was in terms of combat strength, numbers, or equipment, the Zichen Legion soldiers had the advantage. Seeing that this division of the Thunderbolt's army really didn't know what was good for them, they didn't give them any face and directly beat them up before forcefully dragging them away. As the soldiers were dragged out of the battlefield, the chaos at the city gate finally calmed down. But there was also something disharmonious, and that was Fry and Winard, who were in the midst of a fierce battle. Both of them were high-level warriors, and the only difference was that they were at different levels. Now that they were in a life-and-death battle, naturally, their surroundings were filled with combat energy, and no one dared to get close. After a few of the heavy armor soldiers who had accidentally stepped into the battle circle were sent flying a few meters away, the Zichen Legion soldiers stopped in their tracks and looked at each other, a little troubled. There were so many soldiers here, and if they didn't care and swarmed forward, they could naturally stop this battle. But in reality, they obviously couldn't do that. After all, they were only here to stop the fight, and no one wanted to throw their lives away. But if they didn't use this method, they wouldn't be able to find an expert to stop it in such a short time. Cough, cough. After a while, a heavy armor soldier who looked like an officer cleared his throat and shouted at the battlefield, This is the Zechen Legion's defense zone. Please stop fighting immediately, or else we will. Damn it. A few shields were raised at the same time. Bang bang bang. A spear and 2 sword slashes instantly attacked, leaving deep marks on the shields. Of course, these attacks weren't intentional. Now that Fry and Winard were highly focused, they would automatically ignore even if thunder exploded in their ears, let alone roars. You motherf asterisk cur. Putting down the shields and looking at the marks on them, the officer wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. Then, his face darkened and he looked up at the city wall and shouted, "Listen to my orders! Aim! Fire!" Whoosh whoosh whoosh, a round of arrow rain, about 100 arrows poured down in an instant, all accurately hitting this chaotic area that was filled with dust and flashing combat energy. A few arrows shot in, but most of them collided with the combat energy outside and were instantly shattered. But even so, the combat energy could be seen dimming in an instant. This was also why the army focused on the whole, and why some so-called experts didn't play a big role on the battlefield. No matter how strong a person was, there would always be a limit. Even if he could survive a round of arrow rain from 1,000 archers, what about a second round? A third round? Or 2,000 archers? Mjolnir, seeing that the first round of arrow rain was effective, the officer raised his hand again. Aim. Fire. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The combat energy was completely shattered, and 2 figures could be vaguely seen in the dust. One was retreating and the other was advancing. What was certain was that the other party had no intention of stopping. Or at least, one of them didn't want to stop. Courting death. The officer was enraged. Now that there was no light covering him, if he were to fire another round of arrows, the result would most likely be that both of them would be nailed to the ground. However, he had no other choice now. He licked his lips and said, "Aim or shoot, woo-woo." Before he finished speaking, a hand came from behind like a ghost and covered his mouth. A voice sounded in his ear. "Shh. What a delightful revenge drama. Be good, it's almost over, be patient." Chapter 537. Shoo! What a great revenge drama. Be good, it's almost over. Be patient. She was silently touched behind her back and her mouth was even sealed. The officer was shocked and instinctively wanted to turn around and resist. But in the next moment, he felt a cold object on the back of his neck. It was the coldness of a weapon. His body trembled, and he immediately calmed down. At this time, no one was paying attention to the situation because the fierce battle had reached a critical moment. Clang, clang, clang. Dust filled the air, and the loud sound of metal striking could be heard. A figure stepped forward steadily, and the long rod in his hand smashed continuously. "Look, you still don't dare. As a soldier of the Bran, you don't even dare to fight with your life on the line." Another figure retreated in a sorry state, and his footsteps staggered as he barely defended against the torrent of attacks in front of him. It was obvious that his defense had collapsed. His body trembled from time to time, and the sound of a weapon stabbing into his body could be heard. Red blood could be seen from time to time. Powerful, high status, and many soldiers. You have all these. But now, what can you do with all these? Smash, stab, flick, and tap. The long rod moved back and forth, and it was that simple. But in the current situation where he was chasing after the enemy, it couldn't be any more suitable. Strike after strike, each strike faster than the last, completely suppressing his opponent to the point where he couldn't even raise his head. "Do you feel that my fighting style is familiar?" "Yes, this is the fighting style you are most used to." "Don't you have a strong desire to win? Didn't you always say that I'm arrogant?" "Alright, I'll use words that you can understand to tell you the truth. Even if you have a glib tongue and curry favor everywhere, even if you are vicious and cunning, hypocritical and deceitful, even if you are jealous and stab me in the back, I am stronger than you. That was the case in the past, now, and in the future. Every step, every word. Every step, every strike. It was unstoppable, and it was completely crushing. The retreating figure finally couldn't hold on any longer, and his defense completely collapsed. Then, a slightly shrill and hoarse voice full of fear rang out, "You can't kill me, you don't dare to kill me. I'm a deputy general, and if you kill me, you will die." You still think so? You still think so even now? Ridiculous. Do you think I care about that? More than 10 years ago, I traveled thousands of miles and chopped off the head of that retarded noble at the dock. Now, I will also make you bleed at the city gate. Die! With a loud shout, the lightning exploded in the dust like a thunder field in the clouds. People couldn't help but tilt their heads, unable to look directly at it. At this moment, bang! A battle saber with a serrated blade was flung out of the dust. It slid a few feet before landing in front of a heavily armored soldier. All sounds and shadows disappeared, and the scene was silent. A moment later, a cold wind blew and the dust settled. A figure stood upright like a mountain in an abyss. The long spear in his hand was slightly raised, but he did not move an inch. At the tip of the spear hung a figure whose throat had been pierced through, swaying gently in the cold wind. "It's finally over." Tangen's long and narrow eyes narrowed slightly, and he couldn't help but sigh. The one holding the spear was Fry, and the one hanging on the spear was naturally Winard. In the end, Fry managed to turn the tables in a disadvantageous situation and got his revenge. Of course, he had to thank the archers on the city wall for this. Fry took advantage of Winard's distraction to attack wildly, but it wasn't enough to determine victory. When the archers released 2 rounds of arrow rain, the battle finally reached a critical moment. Just as the fighting aura on the periphery dissipated, the archers drew their bows and prepared to release the 3rd round of arrow rain. The 2 people in the field chose completely different ways to deal with it. Fry acted as if he didn't see it and continued to attack with all his might. Winard, on the other hand, was uneasy. His psychological defenses collapsed, and he subconsciously retreated. When gambling with his life like this, he naturally had no chance of survival. This was the principle of the barefoot not being afraid of wearing shoes. Smacking his lips, Tang En patted the shoulder of the officer in front of him. "Okay, this big show is over. Get ready to clean up the mess. Well, it's best to find 2 more coffins or something." With that, he touched his nose and went straight into the dust. Frey's appearance now could be described as miserable. Although his body was standing straight, he was like a water sack riddled with holes, with blood seeping out everywhere. In just a short while, there was already a small pool of blood flowing and gathering around his feet. But he didn't seem to feel it. He stared blankly at Tangen's face for more than 10 seconds before he seemed to recognize him. He grinned. "Ha ha. I've taken revenge." Tang En looked up and down at Frey's injuries, then looked at Winard's body hanging on the spear. His face was full of fear and his eyes were wide open. He spread his hand. "You saw it, He quickly took a few steps forward and hugged Fry, who was falling backward. "Damn, do you have to be so straightforward? Hey, don't faint. At least let's discuss what to do next." "I don't know, hey." Frey's eyes were tightly closed. He had lost the spear in his hand and Winard's body. Naturally, he couldn't answer this question. At this time, the dust had completely dispersed. Scratching his head, Tang En carried Fry on his back and looked at the stunned heavy-armored soldiers around him. He asked hesitantly, "Does this count as us surrendering ourselves?" After about 10 minutes, the bloody incident at the city gate finally came to an end. In the end, a lieutenant general, a division commander, and a number of soldiers were killed. The follow-up was relatively smooth. There were basically no major conflict. Of course, the reason why it was, basically, was mainly because the 1,000 soldiers under Winard were very uncooperative. However, this was the Zechen Legion's defense area. There were archers above to suppress them, and heavy-armored soldiers below to arrest them. In the end, they were suppressed. As for Tang En and the 200 or so soldiers, they were much more obedient. Not only did they throw away their weapons immediately, but they also cooperated with the other party's supervision. They even kindly stepped forward to help the other party suppress the 1,000 or so soldiers who were restless. Of course, the other party didn't seem to appreciate their actions. Instead, they immediately threw them into prison. Although the incident was under control in the shortest time possible, the city's higher-ups were having a headache over how to deal with it. First of all, they could be sure that this incident wasn't a small one. No matter what, 2 high-ranking military officers had died. One of them was a lieutenant general, and the other was a division commander. No matter where it was, it couldn't be easily suppressed. Furthermore, the Zichen Legion wasn't involved in this incident. Therefore, although they knew that Tang En and the others were the ones who attacked first, they didn't have the right to judge them. After all, this was an act that crossed the line and could easily cause conflict between the 2 armies. Moreover, this wasn't the end of it. After some simple questioning, they even found out that the group that attacked first was actually the Grey Coat Army. After hearing this, the city's higher-ups couldn't help but be dumbfounded. The Zichen Legion, the Thunderbolt's army, the Grey Coat Army. The situation was becoming more and more complicated. Naturally, they didn't dare to act rashly. If it was possible, the city's higher-ups wouldn't even care about this incident. They wouldn't even want to get involved. However, the current situation was that they couldn't just ignore this incident. No matter what, this incident happened in the Zichen Legion's defense area. No one could escape from them. After some headaches, the city's higher-ups decided to imprison the 2 groups of people. Those who needed treatment would be treated, and those who needed to be isolated would be isolated. Then, they quickly sent someone to report this incident to the Grand Border City. Not long after, the city's higher-ups felt that this decision was extremely wise. This was because a few hours later, another group of soldiers from the Thunderbolt's army arrived. It was unknown where they got this information from, but 2 battalion commanders actually came looking for them. They were filled with righteous indignation and reported that the dead Winard had secretly ordered the Thunder Spear Regiment to intercept and kill them and the Grey Coat Army soldiers who had made the first move in the wilderness. Moreover, the latter's Thunderbolt Spear Regiment didn't care about the fact that they were facing a powerful enemy and secretly let the barbarians into the defense area. Time, location, people, the clues were clear and the evidence was conclusive. After hearing this, the city's higher-ups broke out in cold sweat. Not to mention whether these people were telling the truth or not, this incident was now related to the internal strife of the army. It was a complete mess. If they had just casually judged the situation, then it would have been a huge joke. Now that things had developed to this point, the city's higher-ups decided not to get involved. Even the people who had started the simple interrogation were withdrawn. They comforted these 3 groups and waited for the higher-ups to take over. However, they didn't know. Even Tang En and Fry didn't know. After some discussion, Eltek and Taka were afraid that this incident would be forcefully suppressed and Tang En and the others would be secretly executed. Thus, they kept spreading this news along with Frey's true identity. At this point, an internal storm within the Bran army was gradually forming. Chapter 538. Prison. As everyone knew, the words that were associated with this term were mostly words that sent chills down people's spines, such as death, ghosts, and so on. But obviously, this prison was not like that. You're all dead. Bastards, go to the gallows. No problem, as long as you let me climb into your mother's bed first. Ha ha. Listen up, you bastards, it's not certain who will die. Stabbing your comrade in the back. If I were you bastards, I wouldn't bother with the gallows, I would just hang myself here. Bullsh *T. Who stabbed their comrade in the back. The general and the division commander were killed by you bastards in front of everyone. Do you think you can deny it? Yo, you really dare to flatter yourselves? Sneak attack? That bullshit general of yours was killed by Battalion Commander Fry with a spear through his throat. As for the division commander, yes, we ganged up on him. But you can only blame yourselves for being too useless and not being able to help at all. What's the noise? All of you, shut up. Do you still want to eat dinner? It was as lively as a market. All kinds of obscenities mixed with the sound of people banging on the iron door echoed in this deep prison. It was deafening. Needless to say, this was naturally the result of Tang En and the thousands of soldiers from Wiener. There was only one prison in the city. In order to separate these two groups of people, the city's higher-ups put in a lot of effort. First, they purposely emptied the prison. Then, they arranged for Tang En and the others to be in the prison for serious criminals. The thousands of soldiers from the Thunderbolt's army were placed in the prison for minor crimes. Then, they transferred a large number of soldiers to the center of the prison to prevent any accident. It couldn't be helped. These were the lords who killed people on the battlefield. If they rioted, even without weapons, the iron fences might not be able to stop them. These measures were not complete. They could stop people, but they couldn't stop sound from spreading. After the two sides knew that as long as they were loud enough, they could reach each other's ears, they immediately started to curse each other with all kinds of slang. This made the Zichen Legion soldiers who were stationed in the center suffer. After half a day, their ears were filled with buzzing echoes. They almost lost their hearing. Finally, after dinner time, the prison slowly quieted down. Cursing was also a physical activity. After half a day of cursing, both sides' throats were dry and exhausted. They urgently needed to replenish their strength for another round. Dinner was not bad. There was meat and soup. If the natives here saw this, they would be so envious that they would drool. This was inevitable. Before the final result was out, the city's upper echelons wanted stability. Naturally, they would not cause dissatisfaction between the two sides. Wow, the food is pretty good. Beef and fish soup, haha. Tang En's men had been starving in the ravine for more than 10 days. They had been in a hurry to hunt down the enemy for half a day and one night, so they did not have time to care about these. However, he didn't expect that he would finally have a good meal in prison. Since that was the case, he naturally wouldn't hold back and swept everything away. It's a pity that I don't have any wine. Otherwise, I would have drunk 3 bowls of wine in a row. Gulp, gulp. Haha, this is great. He finished the bowl of fish soup in one gulp. Then, he pulled up his sleeve and wiped the corners of his mouth, as if he was drinking wine. The skinny monkey-like man's face was flushed red. He seemed to be unusually excited. Not bad. Our brothers have been avenged. De Xiong was more taciturn. After he finished speaking, he also raised his head and drank the fish soup. Then, he lowered his head slightly and looked sad. One was excited and the other was sad. It seemed like a conflict, but it was the best interpretation of revenge and mourning for their brothers. Seeing that the atmosphere was a little strange, David scratched his head and said, I wonder how Brother Fry and Michaud are doing? Although only Wiener and Mason had died in the battle at the city gate, there were many others who had been injured. Tang En's side was fine. Except for Fry, most of them were only lightly injured. However, the 1,000 soldiers of the Thunderbolt's army were very unlucky. First, they were attacked by Tang En and the others. Then, they were surrounded and beaten by the heavy armored soldiers. Many of them were injured. After the battle, these injured people were quickly carried away by the Zichen Legion. They should be fine. Tang En casually grabbed the last piece of meat. He looked at the skinny monkey-like man and said, I checked at the time. Frey's injuries were not light, but they were not fatal. Well, now that the Zichen Legion has been feeding us so well, they will definitely treat us well. Hearing this, everyone nodded and felt a little relieved. David finished his dinner, smacked his lips, and lay down contentedly. Tisk tsk. Now, it's up to Eltek and the others. Twain smiled when he heard that and chewed the meat. With his personality, there was no way he would place all his hopes on others. So, even if Eltek and Taka suddenly changed their mind, he still had a way to spread the news. You guys. At this time, the skinny monkey-like man looked at the clean plate and raised his eyebrows. They haven't finished eating yet, right? David shook his head without thinking. Of course not. This was the truth. In terms of eating speed, who could compare to them when they had been hungry for more than 10 days? The skinny monkey-like man nodded and walked to the metal fence. He suddenly shouted, "Son of a bitch, how does my urine taste? Are you happy eating and drinking? Is it enough? If not, I still have more, it's definitely fresh." Puff. Bamboo, who was drinking the last mouthful of fish soup, spat it out on the spot. He then looked at the skinny monkey-like man who was still describing the filthy things. His fingers trembled as if he wanted to choke him to death. Then, cough cough. "You son of a bitch, puff puff." F***ck. Sounds of spitting and coughing could be heard from far and near. It was like the sound of a symphony in an auditorium. It had to be said that the skinny monkey-like man's trick was very effective. It was very powerful. So powerful that after a while, the Zechen Legion soldiers walked over with twisted faces. Night, Grand Border City. Ziyi's messy house was still lit by the fireplace. 7 or 8 people who looked like high-ranking military officers were gathered there. They wiped the sweat off their foreheads as they passed on the 2 pieces of information that had just been delivered. Most of the people here were generals, so they naturally didn't gather here just for this piece of information. However, this piece of information came at the right time as they were about to finish their strategy discussion. After a while, the information was passed on. Knock knock. Z's fingers tapped on the wooden table rhythmically. He had a smile on his face as he said, "This is quite interesting. Hee, tell me what you think." A rough-looking man slapped his thigh as anger rose on his face. F***ck. This bastard called Wiener deserves to die. He doesn't even deserve to be a general. Everyone nodded. The biggest taboo on the battlefield was to stab a comrade in the back. This was even more shameful than running away. Then, an officer with a slightly gloomy face flicked the information in his hand and laughed. Hee, don't jump to conclusions so quickly. After all, this is only one side of the story. What else is there to say? The orders from the 3 battalions were all there. The evidence is complete and the timing matches. The rough-looking man obviously had a different opinion. He widened his eyes and said, "As long as we investigate the Thunderbolt Spear Regiment, everything will be clear. General, don't be agitated. We haven't investigated it yet. Moreover, this Wiener is the deputy general of an army. It doesn't make sense for him to find trouble with Fry for no reason." The gloomy-looking officer was very cautious, and his eyes were sharp enough to quickly find the illogical points in the information. However, he seemed to have thought of something as he suddenly shrugged and laughed. "However, this has happened, and it even involves the Grey Coat Army. The Thunderbolt's army is in a passive position." There was a hint of schadenfreude in his words, and everyone present chuckled knowingly. There was a lot of competition between the 3 major armies, and some small tricks in the dark had never stopped. Now that they saw the other party in trouble, they were naturally happy. But then again, if this is true, this Fry is a ruthless character who doesn't want to be taken advantage of. Another middle-aged officer commented with a smile. He didn't even think of going back to report to his superiors after being framed. He brought his men and rushed hundreds of miles to take revenge. This Wiener is unlucky to have met the Grey Coat Army who doesn't follow the rules. These words were not biased, but there was also a hint of disagreement with Frey's way of doing things. After all, this was the army, and it was a place where rules were followed. Being framed should be angry, but if it was all settled like this, then there would be no military discipline left. Maybe he thought that once he went back, he wouldn't be able to fight the Deputy General Wiener. So he might as well kill him halfway and end it all. Yes, that makes sense. The heater was burning brightly, and the sound of wood crackling could be heard from time to time. This volcano-like environment was a little strange, but the atmosphere was not bad. The high-ranking officers' tones were also relaxed. They even talked about Frey's surprise attack and admired it. No matter what, this matter did not have much to do with the Zechen Legion. Also, with their status, this kind of thing was just a casual chat, and was not worth worrying about. At this time, Z looked around and fixed his gaze on the right corner. There was a general sitting there, but he had not participated in the discussion since the beginning. He only stared at the intelligence report in front of him, and his rigid face seemed to be deep in thought. Looking at this general, Z's eyes moved slightly, and he smiled. Hee, Ralph, don't always stay in the corner without saying anything. You know the Grey Coat Army the most here, tell me your opinion. General Ralph, who was called, raised his head slightly. His face was still calm, and there was no joy or anger. He looked at Z and nodded, then fell into deep thought. Because of his silence, the room also fell silent. This seemed a bit ostentatious, but the other officers didn't show the slightest bit of surprise at this. That was because this was an extremely normal situation. Everyone knew just how silent this guy, nicknamed the Silent Eagle, was. After a while, Ralph finally finished thinking. He pointed at a spot on the intelligence report in his hand and said calmly, "Fry, I know him." "Yes, you've heard of him too." Chapter 539. When Eltek and Taka reported, they only talked about the despicable deeds of Wiener and Kahlo. They didn't mention Frey's past. It wasn't that they didn't want to talk about it, but it was useless to talk about it with the higher-ups. Of course, Eltek and Taka knew the importance of this. It was no exaggeration to say that this was the key to pardoning Frey's sins. Therefore, they spread the details of this to the public, including Frey's true identity, the past, and the details of their escape. Therefore, the generals of the Zechen Legion naturally didn't know the details. However, Ralph had participated in the encirclement of the Grey Coat Army, so he knew about Fry. He had reported it when he came back, but it had been a long time, so most of them had forgotten about it. After the shock, the room became silent. Everyone looked at each other and patiently listened to Ralph's unique way of speaking. Their expressions were very conflicted, and they felt that the sweat on their foreheads was coming out faster. Finally, after the rough general rubbed his hands no less than 10 times, Ralph's narration finally came to an end. The room instantly became lively. Everyone seemed to be holding their breaths and couldn't wait to express their opinions. Fry. More than 10 years ago, the Lightning Spear Formation breaking team that defeated all enemies? No wonder it sounded familiar. I've heard of this person before. I was only a captain back then. I've known him for a long time. If that's the case, he's really a ruthless character. More than 10 years ago, he traveled thousands of miles and chopped off the heads of nobles. Now that he's doing it again, practice makes perfect. No. In the lively exclamations, Ralph's speech skills seemed to have finished buffering, and he spoke again. Fry has a calm personality. There's more to this than meets the eye. Everyone was stunned and looked at Ralph again. However, the latter had already frowned and entered the Silent Eagle state again. Seeing this, everyone was conflicted again. If Frey's personality was calm, then Ralph's was so calm that it made people speechless. However, calm people had one thing in common. If they didn't have absolute confidence, they wouldn't make a clear judgment. Therefore, Laer Fu obviously knew something, but he couldn't open his mouth to speak in a threatening manner. The frown on his face was not because he was considering whether there were any flaws in his next words, but because he was truly organizing his words. Just as everyone was wiping the sweat off their foreheads and preparing to listen to the horrendous sentences again, the gloomy senior officer finally couldn't help but speak up to save everyone present. General Lay said that there are secret. That reminds me of something. Well, it's just a guess. Hearing this, everyone felt as if they had been pardoned and waved their hands. It's fine. Tell us. To them, they would rather listen to other people's guesses than hear the truth directly from Ralph's mouth. The officer knew what everyone was thinking. He smiled and said, 10 years ago, when the Lightning Spear formation breaking team became famous, I was only a battalion commander. Everyone knows that I have a habit of collecting all kinds of information and slowly analyzing it. One of the officers stroked his beard and nodded. Then, he looked at the pile of information in the room and smiled. Haha, of course we know that. That's why I said that you are the most like a marshal in the Zechen Legion. Don't make fun of me. Haha, the corners of Ziyi's lips curled up slightly when she heard this. She smiled and nodded at the somewhat embarrassed officer, indicating for him to continue. He calmed himself down and continued, At that time, I had the idea of secretly learning from them and collected a lot of information about the Lightning Spear formation breaking team. Yes, I learned a lot. It was also at that time that I found out that in the Thunderbolts Army Division, there was not only Frey's elite team, there was also the Fierce Windagger team. Their fighting power was also not bad. And the leader of this team was Wiener. The two of them knew each other before? TSK, this is getting more and more interesting. The rough officer interrupted. Then, he asked curiously, But, why have I never heard of this Fierce Wind Dagger team? The officer shook his head. The focus of my research was the Lightning Spear formation breaking team, so I didn't know the reason. But it's easy to explain. The situation on the battlefield changes suddenly, and life and death can happen in an instant. Not all elite teams have the chance to make a name for themselves. In addition, with Frey's team at the front, the other elite teams will naturally dim in comparison. He sighed and then his face turned serious. We have more or less heard about Frey's attack on that noble. Let's not talk about whether it was right or not, or whether it was in accordance with military rules. But first, we can be sure of one thing. Someone who can do this for his subordinate who died unjustly should have a commendable character. Now that Frey has returned to the front lines after surviving the disaster, everything has changed. He is only a battalion commander of the Grey Coat Army, and Wiener is a deputy general. Pause for a while. This is something to ponder. If Frey knew about Wiener long ago, and had a grudge against him for a long time, why would he come back to die with such a huge disparity in status? On the other hand, if Wiener knew about Frey first, with his status, it would be easy for him to frame Frey. Of course, this is only my one-sided guess. I can't be sure. But I have been thinking about a question. What kind of hatred is it that the two of them can't let go of after more than 10 years? After thinking about it, my suspect is still Wiener. Frey was willing to travel thousands of miles to kill a noble back then. He obviously doesn't want to live anymore. If there is really a big hatred, why didn't he end Wiener before this? They were in the same division at that time, so there were many opportunities. As for suspecting Wiener, well, I have a guess. Wiener should be related to the noble back then. So now that Frey has returned, he is worried that the matter will be exposed and decided to do something behind the scenes. Of course, this is only a guess. It has been so many years, it is impossible to really reconstruct it. The room was silent. Although the officer kept saying that it was only a guess, he had some confidence in saying it in front of so many people. Everyone didn't immediately express their opinions. Instead, they turned to look at Ralph. The latter was nodding slightly at the army, obviously agreeing with the officer's guess. Everyone saw this and knew that Ralph definitely knew more than the others. Now that he agreed with the officer's guess, the probability of this guess being correct was undoubtedly higher. In the end, this Wiener really deserves to die. No wonder the 2 battalion commanders of the Thunderbolts Army reported him. The rough general stroked his short black beard and curled his lips. Everyone nodded lightly when they heard this, but they didn't say anything about it. Even if the final truth was as they had guessed, Frey's final outcome was still unknown. The reason was simple. Not all the truth could clear the wrongdoer's name. Would the Thunderbolt's army and the Grey Coat army suppress this for the sake of their reputation? After all, Wiener was a deputy general of an army. Would he use the connections he had built previously? Or perhaps there were other people involved in the aristocratic incident. Would they interfere? There were too many uncertainties. The outcome could only depend on the strength of each side. After tapping the table a few times, Z pondered for a while and said, "Then let's do it this way. Report this news to the Thunderbolt's army, yes, and the Grey Coat army. Ask them to send people over to discuss and solve this problem." Everyone raised their eyebrows and couldn't help but chuckle a few times. From their standpoint, it was indeed not good for them to interfere. However, Z reported this news to the Thunderbolt's army and the Grey Coat army at the same time. Obviously, he didn't have good intentions and was prepared to sit and watch the show. Of course, in a sense, this decision was also beneficial to Fry and the others. There was only so much that could be done. It could be considered that Z appreciated Frey's talent and decided to do it in passing. However, what happened next was beyond everyone's expectations. A few days passed in the blink of an eye. The matter continued to ferment. It was just like how the husband was always the last to know that his wife was cheating on him. When the Zechen Legion reported this matter, the higher-ups of the Thunderbolt's army finally found out. No one knew what the discussion was about, but a team formed by a few authoritative figures in the Thunderbolt's army rushed over in the shortest time possible. At the same time, the highest commander of the Grey Coat army at the front line, Daniel, received the news. His face was gloomy. He smashed his desk with his fist and rushed over with the guards. It was also around this time that the news that Eltek and the others had spread in private finally spread to the Thunderbolt's army's defense area. It had to be said that this move caught everyone off guard. The Thunderbolt Spear Formation breaking team's position in the Thunderbolt's army was needless to say. In a short period of time, all kinds of news spread throughout the army as if it had grown wings. What? Captain Fry of the Thunderbolt Spear Formation breaking team didn't die? Deputy General Wiener ordered the Thunderbolt Spear Formation breaking team to kill Captain Fry? The incident with the nobles back then was instigated by Wiener. What? Who is Fry? Damn, are you still a soldier of the Thunderbolt's army? Come, let me have a good talk with you. All kinds of explosive news bombarded the ears of every soldier in the Thunderbolt's army. Even the intense battle at the front line was covered up. The consequences of spreading this kind of news were still unknown. However, what was certain was that this matter was definitely going to blow up. At this time, in a city that had just been defeated by the barbarians, a general covered in blood walked down from the city wall. He then received a report from an officer with a strange expression on his face. After a while, an earth-shattering roar sounded. F***CK. Red-haired weasel, you be ***starred. If I knew this would happen, I would have killed you myself. Men, prepare the horses. A division will follow me. F***CK. Let's see who dares to touch Captain Fry. Chapter 540. Although there were shadows under the sun, there was nowhere to hide in the night. Eltek and Taco were originally from the Thunderbolt's army, so they naturally knew of Frey's influence. Back then, the Thunderbolt Formation breaking team was at its peak. They won every battle and defeated every enemy they met. Then, Fry acted out the tragic scene of a hero chasing after the dead soldiers. Perhaps Colorado's words made sense. People would always glorify and exaggerate a dead person. Fry was amazing back then, and no one after him was able to reach such height. However, due to the limited number of people in the team, Fry definitely did not reach such a position. However, people's thoughts were just that strange. Especially when they were in a passive position in this battle, they would always involuntarily use the deceased to boost their fighting spirit and confidence. Because of this, Frey's Thunderbolt formation breaking team was pushed to its current height. A few days after the news was spread, Eltek and Taka looked at the continuous stream of important figures from the Thunderbolt's army, the highest commander of the Grey Coat Army, and the generals of the Zechen Legion who came to maintain the situation. They vaguely felt that they had made a big deal out of the situation. The result was far beyond their expectations, which made Eltek and Taka very nervous. Now that Tang En was in prison and Fry was in a strictly controlled treatment center, they could not find anyone to discuss this matter with. They could only suppress their nervousness and accept the questions of one important figure after another. They truthfully told them what they had seen and heard during their escape. Then, they broke through the bloodthirsty lion, broke through the Thunderbolt Spear Regiment, moved freely in the encirclement of tens of thousands of barbarians, extinguished 600 wilderness wolf riders with a big fire, and finally escaped from tens of thousands of barbarians. To be honest, after hearing this, even the generals who had seen big scenes were stunned. Those who were more shrewd looked at the extremely nervous Eltek and Taka as if they were crazy. Those who were less shrewd pointed at themselves and said, "Are you King kidding me?" Of course, they were not kidding. Eltek and Taka did not have the guts to do so. Moreover, this matter was easy to prove. There were dozens of brand soldiers who survived. As long as they were questioned separately, it would be clear. Perhaps it was because Eltek and the others' expressions didn't seem to be fake, and there were indeed generals who had done so, but the result was naturally that they were stunned speechless and didn't move for a long time. When this news spread, it naturally caused an uproar, especially among the Thunderbolt's army. After all, Fry had disappeared for more than 10 years. At that time, the soldiers who were in the same period as him were either dead or promoted to officers. As an officer, he naturally had to maintain some dignity. It was not good for him to continue discussing Frey's matter. Therefore, when some of the soldiers habitually praised Fry, most of the stories were hearsay, and they were a little uncertain in their hearts. But everyone knew that Fry was dead, and they couldn't refute his boasting. But now, things were different. Look, the bloodthirsty lions, the wilderness wolf riders, the tens of thousands of barbarians, which one of them was easy to deal with? Captain Fry, on the other hand, had only brought 300 soldiers and 2 battalions of baggage, tears for Urt and Taka. Yet, he dared to cross the wilderness with more than 200 people. How unbelievable was that? What a great achievement! This wasn't even the climax. Later on, there was a rumor that almost pushed Fry to the position of a god. This rumor came from the Zechen Legion, and it was very vivid. It was said that after watching Frey's team escape, the god of war Z was silent for a long time, and then he clapped his hands and sighed. "I can't do it. I can't do it." It was just a few simple words. But because the person who said this was the god of war Z, who was famous throughout the continent, it instantly caused a lot of discussion. For a time, Frey's name became another pillar of faith in the hearts of the soldiers of the 3 major legions. In fact, Z did say that, but there was actually another sentence before that. "So it was you. I can't do it." And at that time, Z said that he had escaped from the encirclement of tens of thousands of barbarians. This meant that the person he was talking to was Tang En, and not Fry. At that time, in front of Z's desk, there was also some simple information about Tang En and a portrait. Of course, no one cared about this. Even if they knew that it was Tang En who did this, they would still choose to ignore it. It was normal. Fry was the battalion commander and the highest-ranking officer. No matter how awesome Tang En was, he was still just a soldier. He must have been groomed by Captain Fry. Looking at it this way, Captain Fry was undoubtedly even more awesome. Now that things had developed to this point, the matter of Fry killing a deputy general of an army and killing Winard was no longer noticed. Of course, the important people who came to deal with this matter naturally didn't think this way. But no matter what they planned to do when they came, they could only follow the procedures meticulously. Some of the possible undercurrents were directly eliminated by the current situation. Naturally, it took a lot of time to follow the procedures. Tang En and the others were still locked up in prison. What happened outside couldn't reach them. With Eltek and the other witnesses, there was basically no need to question them. Therefore, their daily life was basically chewing on grass stalks and lying down idly. If they were awake, they would get up and start a new round of scolding with the thousands of soldiers not far away. This morning, the slowly rising and bleak sun cast rays of light through the gaps in the iron windows. David and the others were sitting cross-legged on the ground gambling. They were making a big fuss and making a lot of noise. Their living conditions were very good now. Not only were they provided with good food and drinks, they would also be satisfied if they asked for something that wasn't too excessive, such as some gambling equipment. Of course, Tang En didn't participate. It wasn't that he was virtuous, but that Skinny Monkey and the others had decisively excluded him after playing with him for a few hours and owing him decades of debt. Of course, this wasn't because Tang En cheated. He wasn't that bad at gambling. It was just that most gambling basically relied on eyesight and hand speed. It was no wonder that Tang En could easily kill everyone, big or small. Once you've made your decision, once you've made your decision, once you've made your decision. Tatarar, just as they were getting excited about gambling, footsteps suddenly came from the passage outside the prison. David grabbed the gambling equipment with one hand and scratched his head with the other. He looked at the sun through the iron window in confusion. Is it time to eat? What time is it now? Damn! Why are you thinking so much? Hurry up and roll. Skinny Monkey didn't have good luck and lost a lot. He looked at the gambling equipment nervously and kept urging. Oh, at this time, the heavy footsteps were getting closer and closer. The iron bars were shaking. David's gambling equipment didn't roll in the end. More and more people frowned and looked outside. They were on guard. They were all veterans. Although the passage was very noisy and echoing, they could still tell that there were many people. There were at least 1,000 of them. Soon, the shadows elongated and the newcomers appeared in everyone's sight. The person in the lead was tall and sturdy. He was wearing high-grade armor and had a murderous aura. Madman? Isn't this Madman? Why are you here? When Skinny Monkey, Bamboo Pole, and the others saw this tall and sturdy man, they were stunned and cried out involuntarily. Tang En also recognized this person. He was one of Frey's old brothers back then. He was the crazy general of the battlefield who had encircled and annihilated the Grey Coat Army, Baylor. Skinny Monkey, Bamboo Pole, Big Bear. After hearing the cries of surprise, Baylor suddenly turned his head and walked quickly to the iron bars. He called out their names one by one. His tiger-like eyes were slightly red, and he looked ashamed. My old brothers, Madman is late. I'm sorry. What are you saying? Skinny Monkey's arm reached through the iron bars and patted Baylor's shoulder vigorously. He smiled and said, It feels like you're sending us to the gallows. Ha! Baylor smiled bitterly and kept shaking his head. I've heard about what happened. I'm sorry. Damn it, if I knew that the red-haired weasel had a hand in that matter back then, I would have killed him long ago. He wouldn't have caused everyone to sigh. Oh, this matter. Bamboo Pole hit Baylor's chest and smiled nonchalantly. It's fine. Didn't he die in our hands too? We've completely avenged our old brothers back then. That's right. We can't get out here. Do you know how Fry is doing now? Baylor nodded. I know. Don't worry. I went to the treatment center when I came here. The people from the Temple of Light are treating Captain Fry. His injuries are almost healed. If it weren't for someone stopping me, I would have been able to meet everyone now. Haha, that's good. When Tang En heard this, he heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he raised his eyebrows. The people from the Temple of Light had always been arrogant. Now that they were willing to come and treat Fry, it seemed like the situation outside was not bad. As expected, after an excited exchange of greetings, Baylor said in shame, "Things are a little complicated now. I'm useless and can't get you out now. However, we'll wait for a few more days. After a few days, I'll definitely get you out personally." Skinny Monkey and the others waved their hand. "Haha, it's fine. Madman, you don't have to worry. We're very comfortable here. We eat and drink every day and don't want to go out." There were some things that did not need to be said. For example, if Baylor knew that they had been locked up here, he would definitely cause a ruckus. He might even get into a fight with some important figures. However, there was indeed no need to say this. After all, they had been friends for decades. It would be pretentious to say anything more. At this moment, Bamboo Pole noticed the black mass of soldiers behind Baylor. He pointed and asked curiously, "Madman, what do you mean by this? Are you thinking of breaking into the prison?" "Of course not. There are too many people outside. If we break into the prison, I don't have enough soldiers." However, Baylor paused and narrowed his eyes. He chuckled and said, "Hee hee, it's more than enough to help my old brothers vent their anger. Yes, I've brought some wine. Let's get drunk later." After he finished speaking, he waved his hand and led the rows of soldiers forward. When everyone heard this, they looked at each other. They did not understand what Baylor meant. However, they immediately understood. In the distance, there was suddenly a commotion from the place where they had been cursing. There were sounds of metal doors crashing, cries of agony, and the sound of fists hitting flesh. It was unusually lively. "You dare to touch my brothers? Damn, beat them up. Beat them to death. I didn't make it in time for the red-haired weasel, and you still want to escape. Today, I'll leave my words here. Unless you don't want to be soldiers of the Thunderbolt's army, I'll beat you up every time I see you." Chapter 541. Haha, over here, over here. I've already booked the most luxurious restaurant in the city. Captain Fry has also sent someone to invite us. We're not going home until we're drunk. Lunatic, what's going on? Let's go to the restaurant first. We'll talk as we walk. The matter was resolved faster than expected. At noon the next day, Tang En and the others were escorted out of prison. When they asked around, it turned out that the investigators had found a letter from a certain archery instructor in the rear when they were searching Winard's house. It talked about the whereabouts of Lance Destroyer. Then, they followed the clues and discovered that the archery instructor was Winard's old subordinate. Also, when Frey's team was assigned to fight, Winard had also interfered and deliberately transferred them to his own defense zone. Naturally, the truth was self-evident. When Tang En and the others heard this, they couldn't help but look at each other in bewilderment. That archery instructor was the one who had competed with Luke in archery when they first arrived at the front line. Nobody had expected that this series of disasters would actually be caused by this inconspicuous factor. They couldn't help but scratch their heads speechlessly. The dust was finally about to settle. The 200 or so survivors gathered in the restaurant again, and couldn't help but sigh. According to Baylor, not only had Tang En, Fry, and the others been cleared of their crimes, they even seemed to have been rewarded. This outcome was within Tang En's expectations. Winard's reputation was already doomed. Naturally, the consequences weren't just for everyone to cheer, but also for some ordinary soldiers. This was a battlefield. It was too easy to scheme against someone, not to mention when there was a huge disparity in status. Such thoughts would undoubtedly lower the morale of the soldiers. Thus, the Thunderbolt's army urgently needed to erect a positive image, such as rewarding Fry and the others, to divert everyone's attention. Of course, it would undoubtedly be better if Fry was still a member of the Thunderbolt's army. Actually, Baylor had secretly mentioned something like this when he was drunk, But Fry didn't know if it was because he didn't understand or because he was drunk, but he always changed the topic. As most of the people present were from the Gray Coat Army, Baylor could not say much after probing a few times. In the end, he could only give up. For the next few days, everyone was in a state of dizziness and drunkenness. This was especially so for Fry, Tang En, and Taka. They were invited by the generals of the Thunderbolt's army in the afternoon and were dragged over by Daniel in the evening. Occasionally, the generals of the Zichen Legion would come over to join in the fun. When it was finally time to rest at night, Baylor came over with a bottle of wine. He drank until the sky turned dark and he was so drunk that he passed out. It was also at this time that Tang En and the others found out about the heated discussions in the outside world. They were a little dumbfounded. Eltek and Taka appeared to be very innocent about this. They had only spread the news to reduce the pressure on them, but who knew that they would end up igniting a barrel of gunpowder? Tang En was still all right because he wasn't well known. Other than a few generals who knew the inside story, not many people paid attention to him. However, it was different for Fry. Previously, he had such a great reputation and now, he had caused such a shocking incident. Even Z was rumored to be inferior to him. His reputation immediately inflated like a balloon. The result of this was that the residence of Tang En and the others was surrounded by soldiers and citizens from time to time. Fry was shocked when he saw this and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. At first, he came forward to explain that it wasn't due to him, that it was due to luck, and so on. Later on, not only did it not have any effect, but more and more people were gathering. He hurriedly returned to the heavily guarded treatment center and didn't dare to come out again. If he had no choice but to go out, he would only dare to walk carefully under Tang En's disguise technique. 3 days later, it was finally time to leave. After all, Baylor was the main general of an army, and the city under his rule was being attacked by the barbarians. Previously, he acted first and reported later, and rushed over with a division of soldiers. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to leave the defense area of the Thunderbolt's army. Even so, when he returned this time, he would definitely be punished by military law. In addition to Baylor, Michaud also left. Michaud's external injuries weren't much of a problem, but the internal organs in his lower abdomen were seriously injured. In addition, he didn't receive timely treatment at that time, so he could only stay on the stretcher now. Tang En was a little depressed about this result. After all, he hadn't seen Sesman yet, and he had already lost a powerful helper. However, at this point, it was useless to sigh. The only thing Tang En could do was to arrange for the second batch of Gray Space members under Michaud to send him back to Dawn City to recuperate. In the morning, Tang En and the others mixed in with Baylor's soldiers and left the city gate. Then, Baylor used the excuse that he had some parting words to say and pulled Fry and the other old brothers to the side. Tang En and the others comforted Michaud and told the accompanying members to pay attention to their safety. Michaud, you can rest assured and recuperate in the rear. When we're done, we'll go back and drink to our heart's content. David patted Michaud's shoulder and comforted him. Michaud's injury was taken for David, and later David took the initiative to take care of Michaud. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the two restored the harmonious relationship they had before. Now, David looked at Michaud's pale face lying in the carriage and couldn't help but feel depressed. Michaud shook his head slightly and looked at Tang En with a sad expression. "Boss, I'm sorry, Michaud knew Tang En's plan, and he also knew that the direct purpose of Tang En's establishment of the Gray Space was to kill Sesman. Now that he had failed to achieve his goal, he had to go back. Naturally, he was extremely unwilling. Tang En waved his hand and interrupted Michaud's words. Recuperation is more important. Everything else is secondary. And, this time when you go back, pay more attention to the movements and the direction of the wind in the base. Collect all kinds of information and send the important information directly to Leader Lhasa. If you don't have enough manpower, you can also expand on your own. Michaud nodded his head repeatedly. Then Luke and the others also came up and laughed and joked around for a while. After a while, under the gazes of Tang En and the others, a dozen or so members of the gray space left in their carriages. After calming himself down, Tang En turned around and saw that Fry wasn't done yet. Baylor was continuously gesturing and saying something. His pleading expression was very obvious, but Fry and the others just stood there quietly, occasionally shaking their heads and saying something. Of course, Tang En knew Baylor's intentions. He wanted to persuade Fry to return to the Thunderbolt's army. On one hand, this was Baylor's strong wish, but on the other hand, it was probably because of the higher-ups of the army. The reason was easy to understand. When the Grey Coat army wasn't strong, Lhasa knew that he had to establish a heroic image. The public opinion that had been rampant in the past few days had undoubtedly pushed Fry to a similar position in the Thunderbolt's army. Tang En didn't know what choice Fry would make. In fact, if Fry chose to return to the Thunderbolt's army, whether it was Tang En, Daniel, Lhasa, or the others, they wouldn't be able to say anything. The Grey Coat army didn't have a policy of forcing people to stay. Although they didn't tolerate betrayal, they wouldn't stop them if they formally applied to leave. At that moment, David's voice came from behind. "Eltek, brother Taka, you're going to get promoted and get rich this time, haha." Tang En turned around and saw Eltek and Taka smiling bitterly. Hee, brother David, don't make fun of us anymore. Our abilities are limited, so we'll just mess around like this." Oh right. It wasn't just Baylor and Michaud who were leaving. As members of the Thunderbolt's army, Eltek and Taka naturally had to rush back in time. In fact, David was right. When they returned this time, they would definitely be waiting for promotions and rewards. Not to mention anything else, even Baylor directly gave the order to transfer them to his army. Also, if Fry decided not to go back, the Thunderbolt's army would definitely publicize the two of them. Although it wouldn't reach Frey's level, as the person involved, they would still be able to appease the soldiers. As they chatted, Luke pointed at Fry and the others in the distance and said with a faint smile, "The Thunderbolt's army isn't very particular. Back then, when Brother Fry was almost hanged, you didn't say anything, but now you're trying to pull him back." Eltek and Taka naturally couldn't say anything about that. They could only smile bitterly. David was puzzled. Right, doesn't Brother Fry have a criminal record? Can he go back like that? He does have a criminal record, but if the army really wants to keep someone safe, there are ways. Eltek scratched his head. Also, I heard from an officer a few days ago that the family of the noble that Captain Fry killed back then has been wiped out. Huh. Eltek spread his hands. A while ago, that family was smuggling into the northern wilderness and was caught by the Zichan army. Marshal Zi has been very strict with this investigation over the years, and directly reported it to the higher-ups. Maybe it was to make an example out of the family, and the Empire then uprooted that family. David was stunned. Is that so? Then, won't it be fine for Brother Fry to go back? Hearing that, Eltek and Taka fell silent again. As members of the Thunderbolt's army, they certainly hoped that Fry could return. But during their days on the run, they were on good terms with Tang En and the others. Naturally, they wouldn't say anything like poaching him in front of them. Right at that moment, all of a sudden, roar! A violent roar rang out not far away. Tang En and the others turned around in surprise, only to see Baylor walking back and forth with a conflicted expression. From time to time, he would clap his hands and appear unusually anxious. Seeing this, Tang En couldn't help but mutter inwardly. Had negotiations broken down, and they had to resolve it by force? Luckily, that wasn't the case. Baylor then raised his head and sighed deeply, giving a standard military salute to Fry and the others. Shaking his head, he walked straight toward his soldiers. Seeing this, Tang En couldn't help but smile. He patted the shoulders of the stunned Eltek and Taka. Haha, quickly catch up if you don't want to go back alone. Chapter 542. No one knew why Fry and his brothers didn't choose to return to the Thunderbolt's army. David did ask about it, but Fry just shrugged and said that he was traumatized and didn't dare to face the Thunderbolt's army again. Tang En and the rest returned to the city. Eltek and Taka were able to leave because they were witnesses. Tang En and the rest were the parties involved, so there were some follow-up matters that needed to be dealt with. Of course, they didn't need to be investigated, but they needed to wait for the brand's reward that Bela mentioned. They were basically waiting for the pie to fall on their heads. During this time, Tang En and Fry discussed and decided on their next itinerary. Actually, it was a bit of an exaggeration to call it a discussion. The two of them sat together for less than 3 minutes, and the matter was settled. It wasn't that they were careless, but they had no other choice. There were a total of 3 army defense zones at the front line. First, the Zechen Legion was excluded. There was no decent battle there at all, and the Zechen Legion didn't need their help at all. Then, the Thunderbolt's army was also excluded. Fry wasn't joking just now. He really didn't want to face the Thunderbolt's army again. It seemed that they only had one last choice left: the Ash Flame army. Tang En naturally had no objections to this. He already knew that Sessman was at the Ash Flame Army's defense zone, so he had to go no matter what. Tang En also told Fry about this. He needed to use the name of the team to go deep into the Ash Flame Army's defense zone. However, if there was a chance for revenge, he would definitely lead the members of the Gray Space to leave the team. Fry already knew Tang En's motive for going to the front line, so he wasn't too surprised. After pondering for a while, he only told him to take care. It wasn't that he didn't want to help Tang En, but this was a serious matter. Suddenly helping would only ruin things. The Temple of Light was an opponent that could make one despair just by thinking about it. As for Tang En and the others, they could only assassinate Sessman secretly. Once exposed, not only Tang En, Fry, and the others but even the Grey Coat Army might be implicated. They didn't have to wait too long. In the morning 2 days later, Fry and the others officially received the award from Bran. In order to make it easier to manage, the soldiers sent by the Grey Coat Army to the front lines had all been incorporated into the Bran Army. As such, the Bran would be the one to give out the soldiers' pay and rewards. To be honest, the reward was very generous. More than 200 soldiers received the Bran's silver medal for bravery, and Fry received the Bran's gold medal for outstanding commander. There were also other things related to honor, but I won't talk about them one by one. The most important thing was the material reward, which was 10,000 gold coins. The award ceremony was quite complicated. When the 10,000 gold coins were actually received, it was already noon. Outside the venue, David and the others were still waiting. Tang En and Fry had to discuss with the generals about going to the Blue Flame Army's defense area, so they hadn't come out yet. Swoosh, swoosh. David shook the 10,000 gold notes and smelled the unique scent of money. He smacked his lips and said proudly, "TSK, TSK, if it wasn't for the 10,000 gold coins, I wouldn't have come to receive this stupid medal." That's right. Damn it, they didn't even find some chairs for us war heroes to sit on. Are they trying to kill me by standing? And that half-dead old man, he really talked a lot and he kept on talking. When I received the medal from him, I was really worried that he would pass out and then blackmail me. The Grey Coat Army was poor, but the soldiers of the Grey Coat Army were even poorer. Compared to the spiritual sense of honor, they were more concerned about the material gains. Of course, it was also because this honor was given to Bran. If it was given by the Grey Coat Army, their attitude would be completely different. However, Skinny Monkey had already carefully kept the medal. He smiled and said, "Since you don't want that stupid medal, why don't you keep it for me?" David was instantly alert. He was brave, but he was more of a money grubber. The medal was made of silver, so he could sell it for some money. Of course, he wouldn't give it away. Furthermore, he smelled a conspiracy in Skinny Monkey's words. He asked cautiously, "This metal? Is there something you haven't told us?" "Why would I?" Skinny Monkey's expression didn't change. He denied it immediately. "I just want to put a few in my pocket and listen to them. Pfft, as if I'd believe you." Waving his hand, David decisively turned his eyes to Big Bear, who had a simple and honest personality. Then he suddenly turned his head and said, "Aha, I saw through you. No winking. Well, Brother Big Bear, what is the use of this metal?" Other than Skinny Monkey, Bamboo Pole, Big Bear and other veterans who had been to the front lines, the rest of the soldiers were from the Gray Coat Army. Naturally, they didn't know about the situation in Bran's army. Big Bear, as his name suggested, was very tall and sturdy. He was almost as tall as the barbarians. He was honest and didn't talk much. He scratched his head and said, "It's somewhat useful. The most direct way is that with these medals you can get more soldiers' pay. I remember that 10 years ago the rule was that bronze medals were twice the pay, silver medals were 3 times the pay, and gold medals were 4 times the pay." F***ck. David was overjoyed. He couldn't help but curse. Then, like all the other soldiers, he wiped the medal and put it in his pocket. Then, David seemed to have thought of something. His eyes flashed and he asked again, "When you get soldiers' pay, do you only look at the medals? How many medals do you have?" "Haha, David, I know what you're thinking." Skinny Monkey laughed and said calmly, "You just want to steal other people's medals. Stop dreaming. There's a record." David glared at him. "Then why did you lie to me before?" "Stupid." Skinny Monkey's expression was full of disdain. He simply said, "Even if there's a record, so many people get soldiers' pay. As long as you're not stupid enough to bring a few medals with you, who would have the time to check them alone? So, as long as you give the medals you got from unknown sources to your friends, you can safely get the extra soldiers' pay." It'll be exposed eventually, right? What if your friends are found out?" Luke interrupted. "It's fine. Nobody will go against money. As long as you know what's good for you and give them some of the extra soldiers' pay, they'll turn a blind eye." "Haha. My horizons have been broadened." Slapping his forehead, David looked convinced. He then waved the gold notes in his hand. "Brother Fry and Boss aren't here, but they already told me how to split the money. Well, take out 3,000 gold coins and send it to the family of the dead brothers. The rest will be split equally." David paused and glanced at Skinny Monkey, who was silently calculating how much he would get. "By the way, Brother Skinny Monkey, you don't have to take this money." "Oh, what?" Skinny Monkey was stunned and exclaimed. Now, it was David's turn to be calm. He waved the gold notes in a fan shape. "Someone seems to have forgotten. A few days ago, I owed Boss a huge debt in prison. Well, let me calculate. Tisk tsk, what a pity. The money I got is far from enough." Skinny Monkey was dumbfounded. He looked at the gold notes waving in front of him as if he was looking at a fat duck that had flown into a pot and was about to fly away. At that moment, Tang En and Fry walked over together. Fry walked in front and waved when he saw everyone. "We're going to the Tsang Yen defense zone. We'll leave tomorrow morning. Let's go and have a big meal first." Oh, immediately there was a burst of cheers. This matter was completely over. Naturally, it was worth celebrating. "Hey boss, what's that in your hand? What kind of reward is it?" At that moment, David saw Tang En walking behind with a purple wooden box in his hand. He couldn't help but ask curiously, "Well, it can be considered a reward." Tang En touched his nose. To be honest, he was also a little confused. He opened the wooden box. "It's just a game of chess." "Well, a game of death." David was even more surprised when he heard that. He leaned over and saw that there was indeed a pocket-sized chessboard in the purple wooden box. Between the horizontal and horizontal lines, there were 2 realistic-looking chess pieces in black and purple colors. This was a game of war chess that was popular in the Bran. Although David's level was limited, he could still understand it. At that moment, the purple chess piece was in a bad situation. The king was surrounded by black chess pieces and was surrounded on all sides. However, the black chess piece was also in danger because a purple cavalry had already forced the black king into a corner. This was definitely a game of death. Whichever side left first would be able to secure the victory. Boss, do you like to play chess? Why didn't I know about it? David looked at the chessboard and was very confused. Tang En also spread out his hand. He was also confused. When he received the wooden box just now, the other side only said that it was specially given to him. He didn't know anything else. The quality of this chessboard and chess pieces is not bad. Maybe it's a reward. Touching his chin, David guessed. Then, he grinned and playfully lifted the purple knight and killed the black king. Haha, this looks much more pleasing to the eye. Alright boss, let's go eat. Okay. Tang En nodded and looked at the chessboard. In the end, he didn't know what to do and just shrugged. He closed the wooden box and put it in his arms. Chapter 543. The next morning, Tang En and his men, who were all wrapped up, slipped out of the gate under the confused gazes of the soldiers. When they were a few miles away, Tang En took off the hat that covered half of his face and sighed. Now I know why Z has been staying in Xiong Pass all this time. It's like being treated like a national treasure panda. A national treasure panda? Fry was a little surprised. He was probably used to the strange words that came out of Tang En's mouth, so he didn't pay much attention to it. He took off the cloth wrapped around his head and smiled bitterly. You were the one who did it. Why did you have to cover my head in the end? Tang En laughed. Haha, the situation is special now. You'll have to endure it for a while longer. He was going to fight Sessman to the death, so it was better if fewer people paid attention to him. Fry shook his head and didn't say anything. They were now crossing the Zichen Legion's defense zone and advancing towards the Tsang Yen Legion's defense zone. There were about 200 people in the team, which wasn't enough for a battalion. However, Daniel had already ordered them to replenish the scattered spearmen of the Grey Coat Army. Although the reinforcements weren't as strong, this was how the battlefield was. The difference between veterans and new recruits wasn't that big. Traveling was boring, and hiding was even more tragic. So let's move our eyes away first and look behind us. The gate opened in the morning. Michaud and his men were planning to enter the city at the same time as the civilians and merchants. However, because of the sudden arrival of a large group of soldiers, they had to move aside first. Hey Captain, there's a team from the Grey Coat Army in here. A member of the Grey Coat Army opened the curtain of the carriage and raised his eyebrows. He turned around and said to Michaud, who was resting with his eyes closed. Michaud opened his eyes and squinted. As expected, behind the soldiers of the Thunderbolt's army, there were soldiers of the Grey Coat Army in plain armor. It was obvious that the relationship between the two groups wasn't very good. Although they entered one after another, there was a large distance between them. The morale of the soldiers was low. They only cared about rushing with their heads down and didn't have the heroic spirit that they should have. Of course, this could also be related to the current environment. This was the Zichen Legion's defense zone. The civilians, merchants, and others had high standard. Naturally, they could not stand the sight of the soldiers of other legions who had obviously been defeated. Therefore, discussions, pointing fingers, and mockery were inevitable. His voice wasn't loud, but his expression couldn't deceive anyone. These soldiers couldn't explain anything to these civilians, so they could only feel depressed. About half an hour later, Michaud and the rest of the soldiers entered the city. Without stopping, the carriage continued to move towards the opposite city gate. Of course, recuperation was the best way to heal, so Michaud and the others needed to get back to Dawn City as soon as possible. Not long after, when the carriage passed through the square in the middle of the city, it had already left the soldiers far behind. At this moment, isn't that Miss Josiah? The curtains were not drawn. The member of the gray space, sitting on the side, exclaimed again. He leaned forward as if he could not believe his eyes. Of course, it was unlikely that they had mistaken him for someone else. After all, they were all trained professionals. Michaud was also surprised when he heard this. With the help of the people around him, he moved to the window. Then, he saw a few travel-worn pedestrians not far away from him. The person in front was a woman wearing a gray robe. Although most of her face was covered by a wide flat hat, Michaud was sure that she was Josiah. Perhaps the woman sensed that someone was looking at her, so she turned her head and looked in his direction. Then, she stopped and opened her mouth slightly. She looked very surprised. It was Josiah. "Stop the carriage." With a long hiss, the speeding carriage immediately slowed down and slowly stopped by the side of the road. The door opened and Josiah came from behind with a few people. Her beautiful face was full of surprise and joy. "Why are you here? Is it Tang? Michaud, are you injured?" Josiah came to the side of the carriage and noticed that Michaud's face was pale and he was lying on the ground. It was obvious that he was seriously injured. "It's just a small injury." Michaud shook his head slightly and smiled. "Haha, Miss Josiah, long time no see. Well, are you here to see the boss?" "Well, I have something to tell Tang." Josiah frowned slightly and looked at Michaud's condition with a worried face. "Your injury is not light. How did it happen? Have you been treated?" Josiah knew Michaud's strength. In addition to Tang En, he was the first person in the gray space. Now that he saw that Michaud was seriously injured, he naturally felt very anxious. "Haha, I'm really fine. According to the boss, well, the parts are not missing, but there is a small hole in the stomach." "Oh, there are two." Michaud and Josiah had known each other for a long time. At that time, Tang En hadn't even joined the Grey Coat Army, so Michaud smiled and shrugged. "Haha, this twain." Josiah couldn't help but laugh when he heard Michaud's words. After confirming that Michaud's injury wasn't serious and that he only needed some time to recuperate, Josiah calmed down and told Josiah the reason why he came here. It turned out that before Tang En came to the front line, he had discussed with Josiah about the establishment of a secret organization here. The main purpose was, of course, to find Sessman. Josiah attached great importance to this matter and knew that the less people involved, the better. Therefore, after stabilizing the rear, he directly took people to the front line. Some time ago, Josiah finally received news about Sessman, but at that time, the barbarians were attacking the barbarians in the wilderness, and Tang En was escaping in the wilderness. Of course, Josiah couldn't get in touch with him. Fortunately, the news about Fry and the others suddenly broke out. Josiah knew that Tang En was with Spearbreaker, so he hurried over. Michaud raised an eyebrow and asked, "It's in the Ashen Flame Legion's area?" Michaud paused for a moment before answering, "Yes, it's in the Ashen Flame Legion's area of defense." Although Michaud was in a coma, he later learned about Totnes from David. He knew that Tang En had roughly located Sessman's location. However, Josiah had countless informants, so his information was undoubtedly more accurate. Michaud smiled bitterly and said, "Unfortunately, you're too late. Boss and the others should have already left for the Grey Flame Army's area." Josiah couldn't help but frown. The Grey Flame Army's area wasn't as peaceful as it was here. It took a lot of effort to pass through every town. Even if she rushed over now, she wouldn't be able to meet Tang En. Michaud comforted, "Don't worry. With Boss's methods, he will definitely be able to locate that person, Joshua?" Before Michaud could finish his words, a figure suddenly jumped out of the road and grabbed Josiah's arm. He looked very excited. "It's really you, Josiah. It's really you, Board?" Josiah was shocked. He subconsciously tried to break free, but when he saw the person in front of him, he was stunned. Michaud frowned. He just realized that when they stopped the car to chat, the large group of soldiers who were left behind had caught up with them. The one who rushed out and grabbed Josiah's arm was Borg. This kind of coincidence really caught them off guard. However, there was a certain inevitability hidden in the coincidence. Borg was also part of the first batch of soldiers who had volunteered to join the expedition. His rank was high, and he led a group of soldiers by himself. Seeing him here meant that his luck wasn't very good. He must have been attacked by the barbarians in or near the wilderness. Borg, your face. At this moment, Joshua seemed to have discovered something and cried out in surprise again. Because of the angle, Michaud also noticed that Borg's handsome face was covered with a long scar that stretched from the corner of his left eye to his chin. It was undoubtedly a knife wound. It was obvious that the scar was newly added. The flesh that had been turned out had not yet fully scabbed over. It looked like a large dark red centipede lying on the ground. It was very creepy. Josiah couldn't break free. Borg was very excited. He shook Josiah's arm and said, "Josiah, it's so good to see you. Did you know? The barbarians were right in front of us. A lot of soldiers died, and I almost died. But it doesn't matter. I haven't lost yet. Next time, I'll definitely win. Josiah, believe me, I'll definitely win next time." At this time, Borg looked like a madman. As he spoke, he opened his arms as if he wanted to hug Josiah. Josiah was obviously frightened by Borg's abnormal state. He stretched out his arm and frowned. Borg, calm down. Calm down? Josiah, I'm very calm. You don't believe that I can win, do you? Am I right? Michaud shook his head. No, I believe you. Put your hand down first. No, you just don't believe me. You'd rather believe that damn Tang En than me, right? He shouted hysterically. But he's definitely dead. Haha, he's definitely dead, slap. After a crisp slap, the scene instantly became silent. Josiah was stunned. Borg, who was covering his face, was also stunned. Michaud was slightly startled. He shrugged and couldn't help but smile. The slap was from Joshua, but it was an unconscious slap while he was trying to parry Borg's random flailing arms. You hit me? You hit me. Good. Borg, I'm not. You hit me. Borg suddenly shouted and put down his hand. His face was clearly branded with a red handprint. His expression was distorted, and the centipede on his face also twisted as if it was alive. You don't like me. You didn't like me from the beginning. Josiah's face darkened. Borg, don't say this. Calm down. I'm very calm. Borg waved his arm vigorously, causing Josiah to take a few steps back. His previous excited expression instantly turned into a neurotic cold sarcasm. I'm disfigured. You don't have to like me anymore. You can throw yourself into the arms of that bastard Tang En without any pressure. Haha, are you satisfied now? You're finally satisfied. Borg, what a farce. He's really a villain. Michaud narrowed his eyes and shook his head. He waved to several members of the gray space next to him and said coldly, "Throw him on the street and let him calm down." Yes. Several members of the gray space next to him heard Borg constantly insulting their boss Tang En. They were already dissatisfied. They immediately got out of the car and surrounded Borg. Borg's strength was not low. Although he was obsessed with tactical command, his good family background still allowed him to have the strength of an intermediate warrior. However, his current state was obviously not right. In his eyes, there was no one but Josiah. Crack. With a few simple joint skills, two members of the gray space quickly caught Borg on the left and right. Then, they lowered their arms slightly and tacitly dislocated Borg's two arms. Hearing the screams, one of the members of the gray space sneered. He lowered his head and said softly, "How dare you touch the boss's woman? Go back to where you came from." As soon as he finished speaking, The two men raised their arms and threw Borg a few feet away. He rolled directly to the middle of the road and directly under the feet of a row of soldiers. Bang, Captain! Captain! Exclamations continued to ring out. Dozens of soldiers quickly surrounded Borg and helped him up from the ground. At this time, Borg finally came to his senses. In fact, the reason why Borg acted so crazily before was because of his defeat and disfigurement. Borg's tactical command level was unquestionable. The fact that he was able to gain the appreciation of old Marshal Omeng and was assured to lead a regiment alone undoubtedly proved this point. However, it was a pity that his understanding of the barbarians was still too shallow. Although he already had an estimation in his mind, when he really faced the barbarians head-on, his tactical knowledge was reduced to the lowest level. In the end, the regiment he led was defeated. However, this result was inevitable. After all, this was the current situation of the Thunderbolt's army. It was already very impressive that he was able to lead the retreating soldiers to successfully shake off the barbarians' pursuit and retreat to the Zechen Legion's defensive area. Unfortunately, the problem was that he still underestimated the barbarians' craziness when they attacked. In the end, his face was slashed by a dying barbarian when he was trying to shake off the barbarians' pursuit. Although Borg was unwilling to accept his defeat, he could still accept it. However, the sudden disfigurement made him somewhat stunned. Borg was not a woman, so he should not have cared so much about his appearance. However, when he wanted to chase Josiah and his biggest competitor was Tang En, this problem was especially crucial. In terms of strength, regardless of whether he admitted it or not, it was a fact that Tang En was several streets ahead of him. In terms of tactics, well, Tang En did not understand tactics, but the Grey Space Troops under his command could paralyze an entire regiment. After thinking about it, Borg finally realized that the only thing he could beat Tang En in now was his appearance. Needless to say, there was no doubt about this. Tang En's ordinary face could at most be said to be not ugly, but it was completely different from being handsome. But now, his only advantage had been lost. Of course, if Borg was given some time, he would still be able to walk out of this shadow. After all, although having a scar on his face was detrimental to his good looks, for a man on the battlefield, it was still a badge of honor. Moreover, there was a large market for iron-blooded men. Unfortunately, fate was fickle. At this moment, the depressed Borg bumped into Josiah. When he came back to his senses, he looked up and saw Michaud sitting in the carriage with a cold expression on his face. Michaud. Borg, of course, recognized the right-hand man of Tang En. His expression instantly became ferocious. He got up and pushed his subordinates away. He turned around and looked around. Where is Tang En? Come out, if you have the guts, come out, come out. Stop shouting. Michaud glanced at him with a sarcastic smile. You're just a loser. Now you're pretending to be a hero. Do you think that, if the boss was really here, you would still be able to stand up now? Bullshit. Borg, who had always been gentle and humble, completely tore off his disguise. His eyes flashed coldly. Well, since Tang En doesn't dare to come out, then don't blame me for killing you. Borg waved his arms. Come, kill a superior officer, capture him for me. Fortunately, Borg still had a trace of rationality left. He forcibly swallowed back the word kill. There was no doubt that infighting in the army was a big taboo, but it was not a problem to find an excuse to capture the opponent. Of course, if he really fell into the hands of the enemy, the result would be hard to say. Borg, how dare you? Josiah's face instantly turned as cold as ice when he heard this, and he anxiously shouted. The slap just now had completely destroyed the hope in Borg's heart. He glanced at Josiah, paused for half a second, and then turned his head away. Do it. The large group of soldiers marching on the street had already stopped when Borg was thrown back, but most of them were soldiers of the Thunderbolt's army. When they saw the Grey Coat army fighting among themselves, they naturally couldn't go forward to stop the fight. Instead, they gathered to watch with interest. Hearing the order, the hundreds of soldiers under Borg couldn't help but look at each other. Even if they didn't know Michaud, they must know Josiah. Naturally, they were a little hesitant. At this time, Josiah also knew that Borg was crazy and wouldn't listen to him at all. There were hundreds of soldiers here, and Michaud was injured, so there was no way for him to hide. Thinking of this, Josiah's face became solemn. He looked around at the soldiers and said, "Do you know what you're doing? The Grey Coat Army is fighting the Grey Coat Army, killing each other." Before he could finish his words, Borg directly interrupted him. "What are you waiting for? Do it. Do it." Military orders were like mountains, and it was the soldiers' duty to obey the orders of their superiors. Although Josiah had a great reputation in the Grey Coat Army, he wasn't in the military system after all, and his position wasn't at the level of a leader or minister. Hearing this, the soldiers could only raise their weapons and slowly surround him. Just as Josiah was about to confront Borg, a member of the Grey Space pulled her back. "Miss Josiah." Michaud then calmly adjusted the blanket covering him and looked at Borg with a mocking expression. "Haha, I often heard Boss say something, and I think it makes sense. Well, I'll give it to you today. If you don't seek death, you won't die." He narrowed his eyes and looked directly at the soldiers of the Thunderbolts' army gathered at the side. He said in a deep voice, "We are the injured soldiers of the spear-breaking formation, Fry. Please help us and take down this lunatic." As soon as he finished speaking, the surroundings suddenly fell silent. The next moment there was an uproar. "What did you say?" Captain Fry. Spear-breaking formation. Thunder spear-breaking formation team, clang, clang, clang. The sound of weapons being unsheathed rose and fell. F***CK. Brothers, F***CK this guy. He's actually Captain Frey's soldier. F***CK we have to help him. Are you blind? How dare you provoke Captain Frey's people? Fight, if there's any problem, it's on me. Chapter 544. The scene fell into chaos. One after another, angry roars resounded through the city. The wide main road was completely blocked in an instant. Looking around, the Thunderbolts' army soldiers were all flushed with excitement. They were either waving their fists or holding their weapons in reverse. One after another, they rushed in. In the middle of the crowd, Borg and his hundreds of soldiers were completely submerged. There was not a trace of them. In such a close encounter with such a large number of enemies, let alone Borg, even if Frey's Lance Destroyer formation were to pull him over, he would still kneel down. "Don't hurt people, don't use weapons." Stop. Both Michaud and Joshua were dumbfounded by this scene. They knew that Fry was influential in the Thunderbolts' army, but now they realized that they had underestimated him too much. After regaining his senses, Josiah anxiously tried to dissuade them from rushing in. However, they could not rush in at all. They could only circle around anxiously. At this moment, beep, 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 mournful whistles sounded one after another. After all, they were in the city, so the patrolling guards were the first to arrive. However, they were also dumbfounded when they saw this spectacular scene. In addition, the Thunderbolts' army soldiers on the periphery were constantly obstructing them. Even if they braced themselves and tried their best to break in, they had little success. Thus, the whistles became more urgent until the city's garrison troops, the Zechen Legion soldiers, arrived. After a while, the Thunderbolts' army soldiers finally dispersed, leaving behind a devastated street and groaning soldiers. Fortunately, no one died. The Thunderbolts' army soldiers still had a sense of propriety. After all, the nature of fighting and killing was completely different. However, even so, most of Borg's soldiers were now unconscious. A few lucky ones were struggling to turn over and groaning in pain. Josiah rummaged through the crowd a few times and finally found Borg. However, her hand immediately trembled, and she cried out in alarm, almost throwing Borg away. Just now, when Michaud asked for help, he was referring to Borg. As a result, these Thunderbolt's army soldiers naturally did a lot of dirty tricks. By now, Borg was completely unconscious. His high-grade armor had been torn into strips, covered in footprints and marks of attack. The most serious injury was on his face. His originally handsome appearance was now bruised and swollen like a pig's head. The centipede wound on his face was torn open again. His face was covered in blood, and his hair was disheveled. He looked extremely disgusting and terrifying. Michaud's eyes twitched when he saw this. He then turned to the soldiers and expressed his gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you for your help, thank you. Ha, this is nothing. You're welcome. That's right. You're Captain Frey's soldier. Everyone has heard about what happened before. Well done. Brother, we call you brother, this is what we should do." Yes. It was only in this city that he really couldn't let loose, and he didn't feel good beating him up. If we were in the wild, humph. It's enough, it's enough. Thank you, a gang fight in the city was no small matter. After the soldiers of the Purple Dawn Legion carried Borg and his subordinates away, many soldiers of the Thunder Crash Legion were also investigated. However, these people were very loyal and didn't reveal the mastermind, Michaud. They laughed and said hello, and then were taken away by the other party. Obviously, they couldn't stay in this place for long. After a warm farewell, Michaud, Josiah, and the others were covered by the Thunderbolt's army soldiers. A few streets away, Michaud patted the carriage and laughed. Haha, I didn't expect Brother Frey's name to be so useful. I really wonder if the Thunderbolt's army soldiers will defect to our Grey Coat army if Brother Frey comes out and raises his arms. Haha, yes. Josiah, who was also sitting in the carriage, also covered his mouth and chuckled. But then he frowned slightly, shook his head, and sighed. I really didn't expect Borg to become like this. This is a typical arrogant and self-righteous person who has never suffered a loss before. Michaud curled his lips and was very disapproving. Then the corners of his mouth suddenly rose. But after this, I think he will have a clear understanding of himself. Borg's usual disguise was very good. He had always been modest and gentle, especially in front of Josiah. So in Josiah's impression, Borg was still the good young man who had gone through trials and tribulations with her and guided her tactics. Now that she saw Borg suddenly erupt with such a hateful side, she couldn't help but feel a little stunned and regretful. Michaud, on the other hand, was different. After being framed and the incident with Bullen, everyone in the gray space had long suspected the Borg family. Naturally, their attitude would not be good. Will Borg be punished this time? Well, although I really want him to be tortured by the soldiers of the Zechen Legion again. But unfortunately, that's unlikely. After pondering for a while, Michaud said regretfully, "It's just an ordinary fight. The relationship between Blank's army and the Grey Coat army is not good, so fighting is common. At most, Borg will be verbally criticized and transferred to the rear to recuperate. It's too easy for him." After chatting for a while, Michaud went back to Dawn City to recuperate, while Josiah planned to stay at the front line and wait for the latest news from Tangan. So after greeting each other, the two parted ways. Right. When the carriage was about to leave, Michaud suddenly remembered something. He leaned out of the window and said casually, "Little Carol is with you, right?" Josiah was startled when he heard this. He blinked and said, "Hasn't little Carol been in Dawn City all this time? She should be looking for you." "Oh no, when did you come to the front line?" "Not long after you set off, No." They looked at each other, and for a moment, their expressions changed drastically. They were speechless. "So, where is little Carol now?" "Let's look at the rear again, in the morning, in a quiet small town in the hinterland of the north." The small town had a long history, but its name was very common. There were thousands of small towns like Bran. There were too many subjective and objective reasons why it did not develop. For example, the terrain was not good, the transportation was not convenient, there were no local products, the city lord was not ambitious, and so on. In short, this small town followed its own fixed rhythm and led an unchanging and ordinary life. However, today the small town suddenly became lively. There was a hubbub of voices, and the simple and mellow faces were full of undisguised joy. They greeted each other and rushed to the south of the town. After a while, the source of the lively scene finally appeared. A few freshly painted white three-story buildings stood in front of everyone's eyes. The small buildings were surrounded by walls and railings, and now, there were many onlookers. In the north was the gate, and on the stone wall beside it, there were bold and powerful words such as, Brandon Civilian Academy, and Knowledge Changes Fate, engraved on the stone wall. Oh, the latter was proposed by someone who had nothing better to do. Later, it was directly adopted by Rosa and became the school motto of all civilian academies. Yes, these small buildings were the academies open to civilian children. It was also one of the results of the Grey Coat Army's many years of hard work. At this point, the rule that the academies on the mainland were only open to the rich and powerful would be completely swept into the garbage heap of history. The crowd gathered at the main gate. A few people in black robes who looked like teachers were surrounded by the people. They explained the origin of the academy, its mission, and the qualifications of civilian children to enroll, the cost, and so on. Among them, a thin middle-aged teacher with curly hair was undoubtedly the most eye-catching. Of course, this was not because of any artistic temperament, but because his expression was the most excited. He waved his fist and shouted at the top of his lungs, "We are a civilian academy. As long as your children reach the appropriate age, they can be sent here to receive the influence of knowledge. Of course, if there are noble children who are willing to come, we will not reject them like they rejected us. Equality is the most important thing here. Everyone who comes here will be treated equally. Why can the children of civilians only become handymen, waiters, coachmen? Why can't they become shop owners, wealthy merchants, or even nobles? The reason is simple. We do not have knowledge. In the past, there was no place to obtain knowledge. That is why we can only be civilians for generations to come. But now, everything is different. Look at the big words on the wall, knowledge changes fate. This is what the leader of the Grey Coat Army, Losha, said. This is what we need to do now. Learn knowledge, only learn for yourself, and firmly grasp your fate in your own hands. The academy is not a shop, it is not a tool to earn money. Our school fees are very cheap. It can't even be compared to the money you donate to the church every month. The gods are high above, they have no time to care about our fate. But if you use this money to send your children to school, it is very likely that you will change your children's lives, and even extend it to a few generations. Because of the hoarse voice, a slightly sharp and hoarse roar echoed in the surroundings. It was as if there was an invisible force that allowed this roar to completely suppress the buzzing noise in the surroundings. This is Mr. Hammond. Didn't they say that he was disrespectful to the church a few years ago and was locked up? A civilian looked at the middle-aged teacher and couldn't help but ask in surprise. A civilian beside him immediately replied, "I know about this. He was released a few days ago, but I didn't expect that he would come here to become a teacher. What's so strange about this? Hammond is a declining noble after all. He should know a lot of things. Well, anyway, what he said makes sense." That's true. Will you send your children here?" "Of course. Damn it, I have been a handyman my whole life. I can't let my children have to pour swill for a living." Similar conversations were happening all around the academy. The content was similar, but most of the civilians decided to send their children to school. This was inevitable. The school fees were originally cheap. Rather than letting their children idle at home or working hard to earn money for child labor, they might as well send their children here to fight for their future. At this moment, outside the crowd, there were two people, one tall and one short, wearing long robes. They were travel-worn outlanders. TSK, speaking of which, your gray coat army is doing pretty well. You even built a commoners' academy. But there is no future for money. What can you earn from this little bit of school fees? And that foolish and bold teacher, TSK, he dares to snatch food from the Temple of Light. He is clearly courting death. When the shorter person heard this, the corner of his mouth twitched. Clearly, he had a different opinion. In the end, he looked at the grand occasion in front of him and simply turned to leave. Vulgar. Chapter 545. Hey, stop. Let's make things clear first. Exasperated, he chased after him from behind and gestured. How am I vulgar? I'm a thief. It's natural for me to love money. His footsteps paused, and the short figure raised his head slightly, revealing half of his frosty little face. It's vulgar. You. Tongue-tied, the taller person was obviously angry. Then he took a deep breath, calmed down a little, and spread out his hands. Whatever, it's hard to explain to a child like you. Your big brother Tang En isn't much better. He's even more greedy than me. The response was a cold, sharp gaze, but the short figure didn't make any further moves. Under the vigilant gaze of the taller figure, he thought for a while. He should also be entangled with Big Brother Tang En's greedy statement. In the end, he shook his head stubbornly and said, Big Brother Tang En is not like you. Curling his lips, the taller person obviously disagreed, but probably also had some concerns. He didn't continue to ridicule Big Brother Tang En. Needless to say, these two people were naturally Jack and Little Carol. As Josiah and Michaud had guessed, the two of them had indeed gone to Mountain Creek City to look for her. Jack was very familiar with the place and also knew where the secret organization was hidden. Unfortunately, Josiah had already set off for the front line, so the two of them naturally came up empty. At this time, Little Carol had two choices. One was to stay in Mountain Creek City and wait for Josiah's return, and the other was to go directly to the front line to look for him. There was no doubt that in order to track down Big Brother Tang En's footsteps, Little Carol didn't hesitate to choose the latter. As for Jack, a good person really can't be. Because he couldn't ridicule a certain guy, and the key was that he was forced to. Jack was in a very bad mood. He raised his head and sighed. I'm already an old man, but I still have to travel thousands of miles to the dangerous battlefield. And not only is there no benefit, but now even professional ethics are despised. One song and three sighs, very sad. The truth was more or less the same. Jack had originally planned to make a few profits in the north before returning to the south. After all, Bose was too much of a deterrent to him. But after meeting Little Carol, this plan naturally died in the womb. No matter what, with his friendship with Tang En, he couldn't just sit by and watch a teenage girl like Little Carol go to the dangerous front line alone, even if this little girl had terrifying skills. Therefore, after Little Carol made her decision, he could only follow her unconditionally. A tragedy was certain, but his words just now had the intention of retreating in order to advance. He wanted Little Carol to comfort him. No matter what, a little girl of her age acting coquettishly was very delightful. Unfortunately, Jack had obviously found the wrong person. Tilting her head, Little Carol looked at Jack, her expression still cold. I didn't ask you to follow me. This was the truth. Jack had indeed volunteered to follow them. And along the way, Little Carol didn't need to help him take care of everything. However, the truth was often the most hurtful. Jack was stunned when he heard this. The difference between reality and his ideal was too great. His expression immediately collapsed. He hugged his head and spread his hands with difficulty. His smile was stiff. Yes, you're right. I was the one who shamelessly insisted on following. And we haven't eaten lunch yet. What should we eat? F*ck Tang En, just you wait. When I find you, if I don't give you 100,000 or 80,000 as compensation for mental damage, don't blame me for spitting in your face, whatever. The small cloth bag swayed in an arc. Little Carol turned around and continued walking. Whatever? No, no, no. After cursing Tang En again, Jack recovered his mood and quickly followed. We have to eat something good because we have big things to do next. After a pause, he nodded solemnly and then looked at Little Carol. First of all, do you still have money? Little Carol stopped and covered the small cloth bag with a guarded expression. She shook her head decisively. No. What's with that expression? The corner of Jack's mouth twitched. He looked like he was about to collapse again. Then he took a deep breath and decided to ignore it. I have good news and bad news. Which one do you want to hear first? After a pause, Jack looked at Little Carol's "you're so boring" cold gaze. He raised his hands, shook his head helplessly, and sighed. Okay, I'll tell you the good news first. It's really the world is bad. Children are no longer innocent. With a sigh, he flipped his right hand and 2 shiny silver coins appeared in his palm. The good news is that we will have a sumptuous lunch and dinner. He retracted his hand and scratched his head, looking a little embarrassed. The bad news is that this is our last funds. And let me solemnly announce that we are officially paupers. Little Carol nodded. And then, of course, we have to find a way to get some money to spend. Jack hammered his palm and gestured. Don't worry, I already have a target. When I entered the city, I saw a message on the notice board. Master Bai in the city lost a dog, and is offering a reward of 10 gold coins to find it. Looking for a dog. Little Carol frowned slightly. Naturally, they couldn't travel without money. However, a dog's target was too small. It would undoubtedly take a lot of effort to find it. Of course not. Jack licked his lips and laughed. Think about it. If he's willing to spend 10 gold coins for a dog, it means that he's filthy rich. If we borrow some money from him, hee. Little Carol suddenly understood. Oh, you mean steal. Ahem, don't make it sound so bad. According to your brother Tang En's words, this is called going out and saving someone in an emergency. Jack raised his eyebrows and was very confident. Okay. She nodded without hesitation. Jack was stunned and opened his mouth. Hey, didn't you say that this was vulgar at the beginning? Why did you agree so readily now? The situation is different, and this is not vulgar. Little Carol calmly raised her head. Brother Tang En said that this is robbing the rich to help the poor. Tsk. Jack smacked his lips and gave a thumbs up. Do you know what I admire about your brother Twain the most? No matter how wretched this kind of work was, he could always find a reason to do it openly, and he did it with a clear conscience. Tsk realm. While shaking his head and talking, Little Carol had calmly turned around and left. Hey, wait for me. I've already planned it. Let's eat first, then check out the area and act at night. I'm a professional in this field. You have to believe in the power of professionals. Dusk fell. The unlucky Master Bai, who was targeted by the thief duo, was the Baron in the city. His manor was located in the East City district. If such a small baron was placed in the south, it was not worth mentioning at all. However, in this small city in the north, he was like a local tyrant. The decoration of the manor was not very gorgeous, but the area was quite large. Of course, the defensive power was not weak either. However, Jack did not disgrace his professional ability. A few hours of scouting in the afternoon allowed them to sneak into the manor smoothly. They only wanted to borrow some travel expenses this time, so they did not choose a warehouse that might be risky. Instead, they went straight to Master Bai's bedroom. Hey, did you see that? This is professionalism. After avoiding the patrolling guards again, Jack swaggered into the interior of the manor, patted his chest and said proudly. But little Carol, as his companion, was not very helpful. She did not cooperate and show even the slightest look of admiration. She was even annoyed by his words and said things like, "Brother Twain can do it too, and he can do it better than you." This made Jack very unhappy. He wished that Twain could appear in front of him right now and give him a good beating. While his thoughts were running wild, Jack took little Carol close to Master Bai's main room. But when they passed through the last flower bush, the two suddenly stopped and squatted down instantly. In the open space in front of the house, there were two majestic black dogs lying on the ground. They looked like giant beasts under the cover of the night. As if they noticed something, the two black dogs half stood up and turned their heads to look at the flowers. After there was no movement for a long time, they squatted down again. F***ck, how much does this buy like dogs? Putting these two things in front of the house, aren't you afraid that they will fight at night and not be able to sleep? Jack, who felt embarrassed in front of little Carol, wiped the cold sweat on his forehead and cursed in a low voice. Then he took out something wrapped in gray cloth from his arms and chuckled softly. Hee, fortunately I was prepared. Dang dang dang. I didn't pack it in vain. The gray cloth was lifted. Turned out to be a bone. Then Jack took out a small bottle of white powder again and sprinkled it evenly. I'll add some more seasoning. Ha. After eating, lie down obediently. After spreading the seasoned bone evenly, Jack quickly threw it out. After a few light pops, the bone rolled smoothly to the two dogs. What? The two black dogs were obviously frightened by the unidentified flying object. They instantly got up and groaned in a low voice. After a while, seeing no other movement, they began to approach the bone. Bite, bite, bite. Seeing the majestic black dogs getting closer and closer, Jack was excited and kept urging them in a low voice. But unfortunately, the two black dogs sniffed the bone and circled it a few times, but they still had no intention of biting it. Damn! Jack couldn't help but curse when he saw this. He then scratched his head and looked at little Carol awkwardly. Maybe I ate too much at dinner. But it's okay, I still have a way. Before he finished speaking, little Carol had already turned into a rapid black shadow. Bang, the grass flew and flashed in front of the two black dogs. The senses of animals were always sharp. The two majestic black dogs' hair instantly stood on end. They suddenly raised their heads and opened their mouths. Hiss, before the dogs barked, there was a slight sound in the air, and the shadow of a waning moon flashed by. Although it was extremely short, there was a soul-stirring beauty to it. Hiss! Dark red liquid sprayed out. Two round objects flew into the air and landed in the grass garden, disappearing without a trace. From the beginning of the attack to the end, only an instant had passed. Then, the place fell into silence again. The night was dark. Some moonlight floated, reflecting the floor in front of the house. Drip, drip. The blade of the scythe was constantly dripping with liquid. The little girl's back was facing the moonlight. Her face was hidden in the shadows and was very blurry. The two beasts beside him had not completely lost their lives. Their bodies were still twitching, and a large amount of dark red blood quickly spread out, covering the bright floor and reflecting the moonlight. Ripples rippled, and the water sparkled. Gulp. Michaud's mouth was wide open as he stared at the strange yet harmonious scene in front of him. He swallowed hard and murmured with a complicated expression on his face. Tangen, what kind of person did you teach? Chapter 546. The night was still dark. A certain duo of thieves succeeded and sneaked out of the manor. Then, they quickly ran out of the East City district and strolled on the dark street. Little Carol, there's something that Brother Jack thinks it's very necessary to discuss with you. Well, being a thief is also a serious profession. It's all about craftsmanship and hard work. As the saying goes, even thieves have morals. You have to admit this, right? Why are you looking at me like that? Well, I'll be direct. When we cooperate again in the future, can you restrain yourself a little? Just a little. We're here to steal. Do you want to kill the watchdog and make it so bloody? And that masturby, he's clearly playing rape with his little lover. Yes, this is a little inappropriate for children. But can't we just use a smoke to knock them out? There's no need to knock them out directly and beat them up violently, right? At least they lent us money. Can't we be a little more friendly? There was no one on the quiet street. Jack gestured and kept nagging, trying to correct the violent girl who had gone astray. Little Carol stopped and looked up. Her expression was still cold, and there was no sign of repentance. Then, she stretched out her small white hand and stared at Jack. What are you doing? Dividing the money. The answer was very concise. Touching the lower half of his cheek, Jack didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I'm your brother. I won't steal your money. Don't you trust me that much? After a moment, looking at little Carol's stubborn expression, Jack knew that he had asked a stupid question again. He took out the stolen money from his arms and waved helplessly. Okay, I see now. You're no different from that Tang-en. Vulgar, too vulgar. Dodge. Jack paused and heard the faint sound of horse hooves coming from the corner of the street ahead. His expression changed, and he quickly pulled little Carol into the alley by the road. Soon, ta-ta-ta-ta. Dozens of garrison cavalry in bronze armor galloped past in the direction of the East City district. Damn, it's happening. Jack was extremely experienced. He knew that Master Bai had been exposed as soon as he saw this situation. He grinned and turned to walk into the deep alley. Let's go. Let's get out of the city first. Little Carol looked at the stolen money that Jack put back into his arms. She curled her lips and followed him, dragging her sickle. Jack, who didn't know that he was being suspected again, said as he walked, "Look, these two black dogs must have been discovered. That's why, as thieves, we have to sneak in quietly. Don't make a move, or else we'll attract unnecessary trouble. With the time difference, we can still easily leave the city now." Although she had been discovered, little Carol's tone was still calm. This was the truth. The walls of this small city couldn't stop them at all. By the time the garrison cavalry finished their investigation, they were already outside the city. It had to be said that under the guidance of a bad person, although this little girl was still immature sexually, she had the ability to see the essence of things. Jack was stunned when he heard that, and he became even angrier. You can't say that. What if the chief of the guards here is Bose? Oh, you don't know this person. Well, do you know that our journey will be smooth sailing? What if something unexpected happens? As they spoke, the two suddenly stopped when they reached the corner of the alley. They saw that in another dead end, there were 3 to 5 black-clothed men with swords and sabers forcing a figure into a corner. Needless to say, they were obviously here to kill. F***ck. Seeing the other party turn around, Jack's expression was bitter. He wanted to slap his own mouth. Damn, who asked you to be so cheap? The two sides stared at each other for a moment. Cough, cough. After 2 dry coughs, Jack slowly raised his hands and forced a smile. Hee brothers, you're busy. We're just passing by. Let's go, let's go. Well, you guys continue. Several black-clothed men looked at each other and then looked at a black-clothed man with a long spear in his hand and his arms crossed. That man should be the leader. At this moment, he narrowed his eyes and looked up and down at Jack and little Carol. He seemed to be considering whether to kill them. Help! Run, all of you, run! At this time, the black shadow forced into the corner suddenly made a hoarse voice. First, he asked for help. Then, he probably saw that there was a child here, so he told them to run. Careful people! Jack smacked his lips and praised inwardly. He stared at the black-clothed man with a spear and slowly retreated to another alley. Although the surrounded man was very nice, Jack didn't intend to be a good person because of this. He didn't want to be inexplicably involved in disputes, especially at this time. But at this moment, Jack's eyes swept over and his footsteps suddenly stopped again. Because little Carol beside him didn't retreat. Instead, she dragged the scythe wrapped in cloth and stepped forward step by step. Little Carol, come back! Little Carol didn't seem to hear Jack's exclamation. She slowly unwrapped the cloth without stopping. Humph, you're courting death. The black-clothed man with a spear, who had just tacitly allowed Jack to retreat, had a murderous look in his eyes. He waved his hand, and the two black-clothed men gathered in the corner separated and went to meet little Carol. Damn it! With a curse, Jack naturally couldn't watch little Carol be in danger alone. With a flash of his hands, he secretly clasped dozens of crescent blades and hurriedly chased after her. At this time, the black-clothed man with a spear behind him turned to look at the man in the corner and sneered. Some words can't be said. If you say it, you'll die. Do it. Whoa. The black-clothed men weren't weak. Their swords were instantly covered in various colors of fighting auras and slashed toward the corner. The surrounded man also had some strength. Yellow fighting auras also erupted from his body. With a roar, he met the attack with his bare hand. As the light flickered, Jack, who was rushing over, glanced in that direction and was immediately stunned. It was him? This was a middle-aged man wearing a tattered black robe and covered in blood. Jack did indeed know him. The last time he saw him was this morning at the entrance of Dawn Academy. At that time, the surrounding people were also discussing. Well, he seemed to be called Horman. Seeing this, Jack couldn't help but realize that little Carol had recognized this person from the beginning, so she didn't hesitate to rescue him. In a daze, when Jack turned his gaze again, he was stunned to find that little Carol had already rushed out of the encirclement. As for the two black-clothed men, one stood in place in a daze, clearly not understanding what was going on. The other was rolling on the ground, howling miserably. His right leg had been cut off at the knee, and the wall beside him was instantly dyed red with blood. These two black-clothed men had been careless. Of course, this was human nature. Who would treat a teenage girl as if they were facing a great enemy? It could only be said that they had only themselves to blame for such a tragic outcome. Whoosh, 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 Jack naturally wouldn't let go of such an opportunity. With a raise of his hand, a dozen crescent blades were instantly thrown out. There was only a slight sound of breaking air, but the attack didn't come. The screams suddenly stopped. The black-clothed man lying on the ground had a blade between his eyebrows, silent and motionless. As the saying went, there was no expert in a fight. Since they had already started, Jack naturally had to end the battle quickly and kill them all. The remaining man was shocked back to his senses and subconsciously waved his large sword to protect his vitals. Puff, puff, puff. His body trembled as blood spurted out. This subconscious reaction saved him. Although there were several wounds on his body, for better or worse, his vitals hadn't been hit. But even so, under Jack's stormy attacks, the situation was equally perilous. Who are you? With a sharp shout, the spear-wielding black-clothed man behind saw that in the blink of an eye, one of them had died and the other was injured. He couldn't help but pull out his spear, his face pale with fright. There was no response. Little Carol had already unleashed her full speed. She pursed her lips and took a step forward, instantly traversing several dozen feet as if she had shrunk the ground. The scythe she had been dragging behind her was now raised high above her head, chopping down like thunder. The spear-wielding black-clothed man didn't dare to be negligent. He immediately raised his spear to parry. Clang! There was a loud bang and sparks flew everywhere. The black-clothed man felt his hands sink and his body bend. His spear was nearly smashed away by a great force. His heart couldn't help but be filled with shock. How was this possible? She's just a teenage girl. There was no clear winner in this move. Little Carol used the recoil force to lightly leap behind the black-clothed man. The two of them instantly brushed past each other. The black-clothed man's eyes flashed. Before he could stand up straight, the spear turned around and passed under his armpit, silently stabbing behind him. Hiss! Missed. There was no physical contact with the spear, so the black-clothed man knew that his spear had missed. Just as he was about to quickly turn around, a scream suddenly rang out beside his ear. Damn it! The black-clothed man instantly reacted. He couldn't help but be shocked and angry. Behind him were several of his subordinates who had besieged Hormund. Now there was no doubt that another one had died. He turned around. The previous encirclement had been broken as expected. Of the three subordinates who had besieged him, one was holding his throat and staggering back. Blood was constantly seeping out from between his fingers. It was obvious that he was dead. The other two were also constantly attacked by the ghost-like short figure. Under various arcs of blade light, they screamed and retreated. As the person involved, Hormund was left to the side. He stared blankly at the battle in front of him and couldn't intervene for a while. When the black-clothed man saw this, he hurriedly brandished his spear to support. However, before he could take a few steps, his body suddenly stopped and he quickly dodged. Whoosh! Just as he dodged, a spinning crescent blade flew past his ear. Yo, your reaction is quite fast. Then try this. A mocking voice sounded behind him. Then whoosh whoosh whoosh. The sound of something breaking through the air rang out. The back of his head felt numb. The black-clothed man didn't need to turn around to know that the space behind him was definitely filled with those strange darts. He helplessly pulled back his spear. His chest was so depressed that he almost wanted to vomit blood. He suddenly turned around and spear shadows appeared, covering an area in an instant. His eyes swept around and found his subordinate lying on the wall of the alley 10 meters away. Needless to say, just by looking at his motionless posture, he knew that he was dead for sure. Damn it, who the hell are these two guys? Ding ding ding. P.S. It's not easy to change the VIP chapters, so I'll explain it here. The Michaud in the penultimate paragraph of the previous chapter should be Jack. Raccoon wrote until 11 o'clock. His mind was in a mess and he didn't check it carefully. I hereby apologize. Also, thank you book friend Emochiju for pointing it out. Thank you. Nonsense doesn't count. Carrot carrot. Chapter 547. Ding ding ding. The sound of impact was like rain hitting banana leaves, and sparks flickered in the dim alley. The black-clothed man's strength was very good. Relying on the nimble spear shadows to seal off the surrounding area, coupled with the occasional teleportation, he actually avoided Jack's round of half-moon blade attack. Oh! Jack couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. He had seen the other party almost kneel down under little Carol's sickle and thought he was another soft persimmon. Who would have thought that he would kick an iron plate? To be able to produce such an effect with just spear techniques, his strength was naturally not low. But strangely, the other party did not use any do-chi. Damn, how could a poor teacher provoke such an expert? Cursing in his heart, Jack cautiously grabbed the half-moon blade, and a red do-chi was faintly discernible in his palm. At this moment, there was another scream, and little Carol had successfully taken care of another opponent. The only remaining person was clearly panicking. If it weren't for the fact that little Carol's attacks were so fierce that he couldn't breathe at all, and that he would definitely be lying on the ground if he wasn't careful, he would have turned around and run without hesitation. The spear-wielding black-clothed man frowned when he saw this. He took a deep breath and then looked deeply at Jack and little Carol, as if to firmly remember their faces in his heart. He waved his spear and charged at Jack. Damn your mother, do you think I'm easy to bully? Seeing the black-clothed man look back and forth and finally decisively charge over, Jack was furious. He had come to pinch a soft persimmon, but in the end, he was being pinched as a soft persimmon. This uncle could endure, but aunt couldn't. Taking a step forward, his hands overlapped, creating several afterimages, and suddenly opened wide. Whoosh, 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 the dense sound of air breaking rang out again, but this time the attack was no longer invisible. The half-moon blades were all faintly red, and as they spun, they drew out flickering afterimages. At this moment, the dim alley seemed to be cut open by these red lines. The black-clothed man's face darkened when he saw this. He seemed to be hesitating, but the half-moon blades didn't give him time to think. They instantly attacked from all kinds of tricky angles. Hiss, hiss, hiss. The spear was waved again, and in an instant, it brought out a fan-like spear shadow. In the end, the black-clothed man didn't use Do-Chi, as if he still wanted to rely on his spear techniques to break Jack's attack. Ding, 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 bang, bang, bang. The moment the densely packed crescent blades came into contact with the layers upon layers of spear shadows, there was an explosion that sounded like beans being fried. The red light and the sparks continued to explode. It was extremely gorgeous. Streaks of red light spun rapidly around the spear's shadow like moths to a flame, colliding with each other from time to time. Some were nailed to the surrounding walls by the strong force, but most of them changed their flight path after the collision, but they would return after a round. This was Jack's fighting style. Although in the eyes of those with great strength, these might just be small tricks that couldn't be put on the table. How could it be as good as crushing someone with great strength? However, Jack had studied it very deeply and formed a unique method of exerting force. Adding on the guidance of his Do-Chi, it caused the half-moon blade that flew out to still stubbornly return and launch an unyielding attack even though it was hit. Of course, this also had to take Jack's wretched personality into consideration. Did you realize that this method of attack is very safe for you compared to Jack, who was leisurely replenishing the number of half-moon blades from time to time? The black-clothed man was much busier. He waved his long spear and danced in the surrounding area tightly, not allowing a single drop of water to leak out. Even if he didn't use his Do-Chi, his line of defense still wasn't broken. However, this kind of good situation naturally didn't last long. The half-moon blades that were infused with Do-Chi could not only fly around, but the strength they added was also very considerable. If the black-clothed man didn't use his Do-Chi, or if he didn't have any Do-Chi at all, then his spear shadow line of defense would quickly collapse under the continuous attacks. In fact, the black-clothed man was already secretly complaining. The tremors from the spear body that constantly reverberated back had already numbed his palm. Moreover, with every collision, the spear would unavoidably deviate a little bit. Don't underestimate this amount of distance. It must be known that the half-moon blades attacked in a cycle. Under this cycle of repeated attacks, the defensive line would be broken sooner or later. At this moment, the black-clothed man's expression was gloomy and uncertain, as if he was still struggling and hesitating. Just at this moment, once again, a miserable howl came from behind. The black-clothed man's heart turned cold. He hurriedly glanced back and saw that the entire right arm of his remaining subordinate was thrown out, hitting the wall on one side. Clang, the long saber that he was tightly holding spun and fell from the palm of his crippled arm. Losing an arm, and it was the right hand that held the weapon, this subordinate's fate in front of that terrifying little girl could be imagined. His eyes became stern. The crippled subordinate made the black-clothed man seem to have made up his mind. The long spear shook, and a dazzling white light suddenly soared into the sky. Roar! In the midst of thunder's roar, the white light around the black-clothed man's body was like a tide that constantly rolled outwards, gradually forming the shape of an armor. On the spear body, it was as if a blazing white flame was ignited, wantonly rising. Bang, bang, bang! In front of this sudden eruption of milky white Do-Chi, the spinning half-moon blades seemed to have suffered a heavy blow. Those that were close to it instantly shattered, turning into iron powder. Hiss! Seeing this, Jack sucked in a breath of cold air. His expression changed greatly, and he subconsciously retreated a few steps. From the degree of the do-chi that erupted, this black-clothed man was at least a peak intermediate martial artist, and it was very likely that he had already reached the early advanced stage. However, this wasn't the reason why Jack's expression changed greatly. After all, although Jack liked to play some small tricks, his do-chi strength had already reached the early advanced stage, so he didn't need to be afraid of the other party. What really frightened him was the origin of this milky white do-chi, as well as the meaning behind it. The situation on the field suddenly changed. Taking advantage of the moment when Jack retreated in shock, the black-clothed man suddenly turned the spear around and smashed it against the wall on the side. Bang! Broken stones flew everywhere, and dust immediately filled the field, covering the black-clothed man's figure. Just at this moment, the black-clothed man's subordinate let out a final cry. The sickle that had a strange attack path had directly slashed his throat. Putting away her blade and turning around, little Carol looked at the situation and frowned. Hormund, who knew a little about martial arts, also looked over. As if he had thought of something, his expression was very horrified. "Damn it, damn it, damn it!" Jack, who had recovered from his shock, trembled. His expression kept changing, and his lips unconsciously trembled as he cursed. However, his figure wasn't slow. Ignoring the danger, he instantly rushed into the dust. The surrounding alley was still dusky and boundless, and the remote areas were even more serene, like the open fangs of a demon. After a moment, Jack, who was covered in dust, once again turned around. His expression was even gloomy. It was obvious that he hadn't been able to catch up to the black-clothed man. Quickly walking a few steps, he arrived in front of Hormund, grabbed his collar, and roared, "Damn it, who the hell are you? Why does someone from the Temple of Light want to kill you?" That's right, the black-clothed man just now was from the Temple of Light. The reason why he was so sure of this was because that final burst of dazzling white light was clearly the Temple of Light's exclusive do-chi, Holy Light do-chi. I am Hormund, a teacher at Dawn Commoner Academy. Hormund seemed to have recovered from his shock and subconsciously replied. Hearing this, Jack stared blankly. Only then did he remember the other party's identity. Then, he instantly thought of what had happened this morning. This was Hormund's shouting speech in front of the academy. He remembered that at that time, he had said that this person dared to snatch food from the Temple of Light and was clearly courting death. Under the inexplicable gaze of little Carol, Jack slowly loosened his grip on Hormund's collar. Then, he suddenly raised his hand and slapped himself. His expression was extremely sorrowful and indignant. "Damn it, I let my mouth be cheap, I let my mouth be cheap." The scene was silent. Little Carol and Hormund were both petrified. Suddenly, beep beep. The faint sound of a police whistle could be heard from the distance. Jack suddenly turned his head and looked at the distant night sky. The corner of his mouth twitched a few times. Then, he called little Carol over and patted Hormund's shoulder. "You should be clear about what happened just now. Your mouth was cheap, and so was my damn mouth. Alright, let's not talk about this now. If King accept my fate. Do you have a wife or a child? No? Very good. As the saying goes, if you want to save someone, you should go all the way. First, bring us out of the city together. Then, everyone will run on their own. Okay?" Hearing this, Hormund considered for a second and nodded in agreement. "Very good. Let's go now." Jack immediately turned around and looked at little Carol, who seemed to have realized the seriousness of the problem. He let out a long sigh. Little Carol, I don't know now whether it's you or me who's done this to you. I accidentally provoked such a huge monster. How am I going to explain it to Twain? Forget it. Let's run first. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.